The forest is awake. What time is it where you are? And from where do you listen? Subscribe and hear what hides in the dark. The woods were always quiet, but that night, they felt weirdly quiet. I don't know how to explain it exactly, like the forest itself was waiting for something. My boots crunched over the dirt trail as Ryan and I moved deeper into the southern quadrant of Black Ridge. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. Nothing about this job ever felt routine anymore. Ryan was new, fresh out of training, full of questions and energy, practically bouncing as he walked beside me. "This place is amazing," he said, gesturing at the endless expanse of trees. "I don't get why people say it's creepy." I didn't answer right away. How could I explain the feeling that had been gnawing at me for weeks? The forest didn't just feel creepy, it felt alive, watching. And with all the disappearances lately, I didn't trust it. "You'll see," I said finally. It wasn't much of an answer, but I wasn't about to dump my paranoia on him. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail like claws. I checked my watch. 6:45 p.m. Sundown wasn't far off, and the rules were clear. We were supposed to be back at the station before dark. No exceptions. I quickened my pace, but Ryan lingered behind, staring at something on the ground. "What is it?" I called back. "Not sure," he replied, crouching. "Looks like blood?" I froze. Sure enough, there was a dark stain on the trail. Fresh. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, scanning the area. "It could be an animal," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Ryan didn't respond. His attention had shifted to the woods on our right. His brow furrowed. "Hey, do you see that?" he asked, pointing. At first I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows, but then, there, a figure, small, motionless. My breath caught. It looked like a kid, maybe 8 or 9, standing just at the edge of the trees. "What the hell?" I muttered. Kids weren't supposed to be out here. No one was, not this late. "I'll check it out," Ryan said, already stepping off the trail. "Wait," I snapped, grabbing his arm. "You don't just walk into the woods after some random—" "It's a kid, Chris," he cut me off, shaking me loose. "What if they're lost?" Something about the way the child stood there, so still, sent a chill down my spine. But before I could stop him, Ryan was gone, flashlight bouncing as he pushed through the underbrush. "Ryan," I called after him. "We don't have time for this. We need to head back, now." No answer. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant snap of a branch. I stayed where I was, my hand hovering near my radio. Protocol said we weren't supposed to leave the trail. Whatever this was, it didn't feel right. Minutes passed. The forest seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in around me. I glanced at my watch again. 7:05 p.m. My gut churned. Ryan should have been back by now. I grabbed my radio. "Ryan, where are you? Do you copy?" Static. I tried again, my voice more urgent. "Ryan, answer me. We need to get out of here." For a moment there was nothing but the crackle of static. Then faintly, his voice came through. "Chris, I think I found." The transmission cut off abruptly. My pulse quickened. "Ryan, repeat that. What did you find?" No response. Just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Screw the rules. I wasn't leaving him out there. I drew my flashlight and stepped off the trail, following the direction Ryan had gone. The underbrush was thick, branches snagging at my jacket as I pushed forward. Every step felt wrong, like the forest didn't want me there. "Ryan!" I shouted, my voice echoing. "Answer me!" Nothing. And then, footsteps. Light, quick, moving just ahead of me. Relief flooded my chest. "Ryan, is that you?" The footsteps stopped. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I scanned the trees. "Ryan?" My voice cracked. A faint whisper answered. My name. Chris. It didn't sound like Ryan. It sounded off, like someone else was trying to mimic his voice. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Shadows shifted, trees loomed, but there was no one there. "Ryan!" I shouted again, desperation creeping in. "If this is a joke, it's not funny." Something rustled to my left. I spun toward the sound, flashlight trembling in my grip. My stomach dropped. There, caught in the beam, was Ryan's radio. It lay on the ground, cracked and smeared with blood. I backed away, my breaths coming fast and shallow. This wasn't right. Something had happened to him. Something bad. I then saw it. Movement. A figure, small and hunched, darting between the trees. It wasn't Ryan. It wasn't even human. I turned and ran, branches whipping at my face, roots clawing at my boots. The voices followed me, faint and mocking. "Chris, come back." By the time I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the main trail, my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I didn't stop running until the ranger station came into view, its floodlights piercing the darkness. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me. The other rangers looked up, startled. "Where's Ryan?" someone asked. I couldn't answer. All I could do was shake my head, my mind replaying those voices, that figure in the woods. Later that night they asked me to file a report. I told them everything, but they didn't seem surprised. They just nodded, like they'd heard it all before. The next day, Ryan's name was quietly removed from the roster. No explanation, no investigation. Just nothing. And that's when I realized, whatever's out there in the forest, it doesn't leave survivors. The next morning, Lena arrived without much of an introduction. She was sharp-eyed, older than me by a couple of years, and her posture screamed authority. It was clear from the start that Lena wasn't here to make friends. Not that I wanted to talk. After what happened to Ryan, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that kid in the red hoodie, or whatever it was, standing just beyond the tree line. "Chris," Lena said curtly as we prepped the jeep for patrol. "Here's how this works. You follow my lead, no questions. We stick to the trails. We don't split up. And if you hear something, anything, you ignore it. Understood?" "Yeah," I muttered, pretending to focus on the map in my hands. She didn't seem satisfied. "I'm serious. No wandering off. No heroics. You do exactly what I say, or you'll end up like your rookie friend." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean by that?" I demanded. Lena didn't look at me. She grabbed the thermal camera from the equipment locker and tossed it into the jeep. "People go missing out here," she said. "That's all you need to know." It wasn't all I needed to know, not by a long shot, but something in her tone made me shut up. The air was heavier that day, the kind of damp heat that made every breath feel sticky. As we drove deeper into the northern quadrant, the forest thickened, the trees towering like sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Even in daylight, the place felt oppressive. Shadows pooled beneath the canopy, and the faint hum of cicadas did little to drown out the feeling of being watched. Lena barely spoke as she navigated the jeep down the overgrown trail. Her eyes constantly scanned the trees, her hand hovering near her rifle. I tried to focus on the map, but my mind kept drifting back to Ryan. What had he seen before he disappeared? What had taken him? "We're close," Lena said suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Close to what?" "There was a report of an abandoned campsite near here. We're going to check it out." I didn't like the sound of that. The last abandoned campsite I'd seen had bloodstains and shredded gear, and I wasn't eager to repeat the experience. But Lena didn't wait for my input. She stopped the jeep, grabbed the thermal camera, and gestured for me to follow. The campsite was a mess. Torn tents lay crumpled on the ground, their fabrics stained and shredded. A charred fire pit sat at the center, surrounded by scattered belongings. A backpack, a child's stuffed animal, a pair of broken glasses. My stomach twisted. "Animal attack?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Lena didn't respond. She knelt beside the fire pit, running her fingers over the claw marks gouged into the dirt. Then she pulled out the thermal camera and scanned the area. "What are you looking for?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer right away. Then she stopped, her body going rigid. "There," she said, her voice low. She handed me the camera. I hesitated before looking. The screen flickered with faint static. I then saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was humanoid, but wrong. The shape was too tall, too thin, and cold as death on the thermal display. "What is that?" I whispered. "Trouble," Lena said, taking the camera back. "We're leaving, now." Back in the Jeep, Lena's mood had shifted from stern to outright hostile. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the mirrors, as if she expected something to be following us. I didn't have to ask if she saw it too. The answer was written all over her face. "Okay, seriously," I said, breaking the tense silence. "What's going on out here? What was that thing?" "It's not your concern," she snapped. "The hell it's not. I saw it. I saw what it did to Ryan." Lena's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you saw." "Then tell me," I shouted. "Because whatever's out here, it's not just animals or bad luck. People are dying, Lena. And you know why, don't you?" She didn't answer. The only sound was the crunch of tires on gravel as we sped back toward the station. We were halfway there when the forest came alive. It started with the sound of branches snapping, followed by something crashing through the underbrush. Lena slammed on the brakes, and we both grabbed our rifles. The Jeep's headlights illuminated the trail ahead, but nothing moved. Just the swaying of trees in the breeze. "Stay here," Lena ordered, stepping out of the vehicle. "Like hell I will," I muttered, following her. My hands shook as I held my rifle, scanning the darkness for movement. The forest was too quiet now, the air thick with tension. I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the left. Lena heard it too. She raised her rifle, her finger on the trigger. "Don't move," she whispered. The growl grew louder, closer. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to pinpoint the source. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them. Eyes. Reflective, glowing, staring at us from the tree line. Not one pair, but many. "Back to the Jeep," Lena said, her voice barely audible. Slowly, we moved in unison, stepping backward toward the vehicle. The eyes didn't blink, didn't flinch. They just watched. And then they moved. The figures emerged from the shadows, their shapes flickering in and out of the light. Pale, elongated bodies with limbs that bent the wrong way, their movements jerky and unnatural. I froze, my brain struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. "Chris, move," Lena barked. The creatures darted toward us faster than anything I'd ever seen. I fired wildly, the sound of gunfire deafening in the confined space of the forest. One of the creatures fell, its body twisting unnaturally as it hit the ground. But the others kept coming. Lena grabbed me, dragging me toward the Jeep as I continued firing. We barely made it inside, slamming the doors just as the creatures clawed at the windows. Their faces, if you could call them that, were pressed against the glass, pale and featureless, except for those glowing eyes. Lena floored the gas, and the Jeep lurched forward, the creatures chasing us down the trail. I didn't stop shooting until the headlights illuminated the ranger station in the distance. The creatures stopped abruptly, retreating into the shadows as if the light repelled them. We skidded to a stop outside the station. Lena turned off the engine and sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly her hands shook. "What the hell were those things?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Lena didn't answer. She just looked at me, her expression cold and distant. "That's why you don't ask questions." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. We left before dawn, just as the fog began to curl through the trees like pale fingers. Lena didn't say much as we loaded the Jeep, her face set like stone. I'd stopped trying to get answers from her. Whatever was going on out here, she knew it, but getting her to talk was like prying open a steel trap. Still, the silence weighed on me. I was on edge, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the shadows. I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. The creatures, their glowing eyes, the way they moved. No animal I knew moved like that. No animal should. "We'll patrol the northern sector," Lena said finally, her voice sharp and clipped. "Keep your weapon close and your head on straight. If something happens, follow my lead. Got it? Got it, I muttered, not like I had much of a choice. The northern sector was a nightmare. The trees were denser here, the canopy so thick it blocked out the rising sun. The jeep's headlights struggled to pierce the gloom, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like they were alive. Lena drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her rifle. Her eyes never stopped scanning the trees. I gripped my own rifle tightly, my palms slick with sweat. Why the northern sector? I asked, breaking the silence. There's been activity up here, Lena said without looking at me. Campers heard voices, things moving in the night. Voices, I repeated, my stomach tightening. Like Ryan's? She shot me a glance, her expression unreadable. Just stay focused. Halfway through the patrol, the jeep stalled. The engine sputtered once, then died, leaving us stranded in the middle of the forest. I could feel my pulse quicken as Lena cursed under her breath and popped the hood. Stay in the jeep, she ordered, stepping out. I didn't argue. I watched her through the windshield as she fiddled with the engine, her movements quick and efficient. But something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. Then from the radio, a faint crackle. I grabbed it, my hands trembling. Lena, the radio. Before I could finish, a voice came through, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Chris, help me. My blood turned to ice. It was Ryan. Lena, I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. It's him, it's Ryan. Lena's head snapped up. Turn it off, she barked, slamming the hood shut and climbing back into the jeep. Now. But, turn it off, she shouted. I fumbled with the radio, my fingers clumsy with fear. The static hissed and popped, Ryan's voice breaking through again, more urgent this time. Chris, I'm here. Please. I shut it off, my heart pounding. Lena didn't say anything as she tried the engine again. It roared to life, but I barely felt the relief. My mind was spinning, torn between terror and guilt. What if it really was him? We drove in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer, their branches scraping against the jeep like nails on a chalkboard. I kept glancing at the thermal camera in my lap, half hoping, half dreading that I'd see something. And then I did. Lena, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Stop the jeep. She hit the brakes, her eyes narrowing as she turned to me. What is it? I held up the thermal camera, my hands shaking. On the screen was a figure, human-shaped but cold. It stood motionless about 50 yards ahead, just off the trail. Lena grabbed the camera, her jaw tightening. Damn it, she muttered. She turned off the headlights, plunging us into near total darkness. Grab your rifle, stay close. We moved quietly, our boots crunching on the gravel as we approached the spot where I'd seen the figure. The darkness was suffocating, the only light coming from the weak beam of Lena's flashlight. My grip on the rifle was so tight it hurt. The figure was gone, but the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but Lena pressed forward, her movements deliberate. And we heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of branches snapping. I swung the flashlight around, the beam trembling as it cut through the trees. The growl came again, closer this time. Lena, I whispered, my voice shaking. What is that? She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her rifle, her eyes fixed on something ahead. I followed her gaze and froze. There were eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They blinked in unison, and my stomach turned. Back to the jeep, Lena said, her voice low and steady. Now. We moved slowly at first, trying not to provoke whatever was out there. But the eyes didn't stay still. They moved closer, and with them came the sound of footsteps, hundreds of them, all around us, circling, closing in. Lena didn't wait. She turned and ran, and I followed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The footsteps were deafening now, the growls turning into a cacophony of screeches and howls. I didn't dare look back. We reached the jeep and scrambled inside, slamming the doors just as the creatures burst from the trees. Pale, twisted forms with two long limbs and faces that were almost human but not. One of them lunged at the windshield, its jagged teeth scraping against the glass. I fired through the window, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. "Drive!" I shouted, but Lena was already flooring the gas. The Jeep lurched forward, throwing the creatures off as we sped down the trail. They gave chase, their movements unnaturally fast, their bodies flickering in and out of view. "Don't stop," Lena said through gritted teeth, her hands tight on the wheel. "No matter what, don't stop." The creatures finally stopped chasing us as we approached the station. I don't know why, maybe the floodlights scared them off, but I didn't care. We stumbled out of the Jeep, battered and shaken, but alive. Inside, the station was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Carter, the ranger on shift, was gone. His gear was still there, his radio crackling faintly on the desk. But there was no sign of him. "Lena," I started, but she cut me off. "We're locking down," she said, her voice cold and final. "No one leaves this building until sunrise." I nodded, too shaken to argue. But as I sat in the corner of the room, clutching my rifle, it wasn't over. The voices were still there, faint and distant, just at the edge of my hearing. "Chris," they called. "Come back." And somewhere in the darkness, they were waiting. The next morning, we staggered into the sunlight like survivors of a war. The forest behind us loomed dark and silent, but I could still feel its presence. Hungry. We didn't speak as we climbed into the battered Jeep, Lena's hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. The road out felt endless. When the trees finally thinned, and the small ranger station gave way to the open highway, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I turned to Lena, her face pale and drawn, her eyes locked on the road ahead. "Never again," I muttered, more to myself than to her. She nodded once, her lips pressed into a tight line. We didn't look back. We couldn't. Because if we did, we both knew we might never leave. We are never going into those woods again. I stepped out of the house, Roscoe's leash tight in my grip, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the world's holding its breath. Normally, even in this sleepy town, you'd hear something. A car in the distance, the buzz of a street lamp, maybe a dog barking. But tonight, it was just me, Roscoe, and the sound of his nails clicking against the pavement. Roscoe, my big brindled pit bull, trotted ahead, his ears perked and nose twitching. He was in his element, tail swaying confidently. I tried to match his energy, but something about the air felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on me. Still, it was just another walk. I told myself to shake it off. We rounded the corner onto the main road, where the forest started to creep closer to the edges of the houses. That's when I saw them, the coyotes. 3 of them, standing at the edge of the woods where the road curved toward the trailhead. At first I thought they were just passing through. Coyotes aren't uncommon around here, though you usually hear them before you see them. These, though, they were silent. Still. Too still. Roscoe noticed them too, his ears pinned back, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. I tightened my grip on the leash. "Easy, buddy," I whispered, my voice barely breaking the silence. The coyotes didn't move, didn't flinch. They just stared, their eyes reflecting the pale glow of the street lamp. Then, almost as if on cue, they started walking, not away, but toward the trail. And every few steps they'd stop and look back at me. Not at Roscoe. At me. I laughed nervously. "What? You guys giving me a tour now?" I muttered, trying to keep my tone light, but the words felt hollow. My feet hesitated, but Roscoe tugged forward, pulling me along. The coyotes disappeared into the shadows, but the feeling they left behind lingered. As we approached the woods, the smell hit me. Rot. Thick and sour, like something had been left to fester for weeks. I gagged, covering my mouth with my free hand. Roscoe froze, his fur bristling. His growl turned into a snarl, and he started backing up, something he never did. "All right, we're turning back," I said, but my voice shook. I yanked the leash, but Roscoe didn't budge. His eyes were locked on something ahead, something I couldn't see yet. And then I saw it. It wasn't much. Just a blur of movement in the trees. Pale, fast, and impossibly smooth. It was there, then gone, like a ripple in the darkness. My heart slammed against my ribs. I gripped Roscoe's leash tighter and swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing. Just an animal, a deer maybe. But my gut was screaming at me to leave. We were almost at the trailhead when the smell got stronger, thick enough to make my eyes water. Roscoe was shaking now, pulling against the leash to go back, but I caught sight of one of the coyotes again. It was crouched low on the opposite side of the road, separated from the woods by a thin stretch of gravel. Its head was tilted, eyes locked on me. It wasn't moving, wasn't even breathing. Something about the way it crouched made my skin crawl. It didn't look like it should be able to stay in that position for so long. My flashlight cut through the dark, landing square on its face. Its eyes didn't even flicker. I thought about taking a picture, but I didn't want to take my eyes off it. Roscoe started pulling harder, practically dragging me backward. Okay, we're going," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. I stepped back, then again, never taking my eyes off the coyote. That's when it happened. In the space of a single breath, it was closer, at least 20 feet closer. It hadn't moved. I didn't see it move. But it was there, crouched in the same unnatural pose, its eyes still locked on me. My heart stopped. My flashlight shook in my hand as I fumbled to steady it. But the beam only made the coyote look more wrong, more unnatural. "Let's go, Roscoe," I said, my voice cracking. I didn't wait for him to follow. I turned and started walking fast, almost jogging, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I glanced back once, just once, and saw the coyote still there, still watching, but now standing upright, silhouetted against the tree line. The walk home felt endless. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made me jump. Roscoe stayed close to my side, his tail tucked, his growls low and constant. By the time we reached the door, I felt like I was being suffocated by the weight of something unseen. I slammed it shut, locked it, and double-checked every window in the house. That night, Roscoe didn't leave his spot by the front door. He sat there, stiff and alert, growling at shadows I couldn't see. And even though I was safe inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching. I thought I was losing it. Sitting on the couch, I kept replaying the night in my head. The coyotes, the smell, that thing I'd seen darting through the trees. My logical brain tried to explain it away. Maybe the coyotes were sick, and the thing in the woods was a deer moving too fast for me to process. But none of it sat right, especially the way that lone coyote had moved, or hadn't moved. Roscoe was still planted by the front door, growling every so often at nothing in particular. I could tell he wasn't going to let up. The tension in the house was thick, pressing on me, suffocating. I needed to get out, even just for a little bit. So I grabbed Pepper's leash and called her over. Pepper, my Jack Russell mix, came bounding up like her usual excitable self, wagging her tail and hopping on her back legs. Her energy was a relief. Unlike Roscoe, who had clearly sensed something I couldn't, Pepper seemed completely unaware of the weirdness in the air. I told myself her carefree demeanor was a good sign. We headed out into the night. The neighborhood was quiet, and the streetlights buzzed faintly overhead. The stillness that had felt oppressive earlier now felt almost peaceful. I kept to the streets closer to the town center, deliberately avoiding the woods. Pepper trotted along happily, sniffing every mailbox and bush, oblivious to my unease. I even started to relax a little, chatting with my wife on the phone as we walked. "I think I just freaked myself out earlier," I said, forcing a laugh. "Coyotes are weird sometimes, right? And that smell? Probably just roadkill or something." My wife humored me, though I could tell she wasn't buying my casual tone. She knew me too well. "Just be careful, okay?" she said, "and don't stay out too long." Yeah, I replied, waving it off. I didn't want to admit how much her words unsettled me. Pepper and I were only a few blocks from home, and nothing felt off. Not yet. We turned down the alley that ran behind my house, a shortcut I'd taken 100 times before. The alley was narrow, with tall wooden fences on either side, and a single streetlight at the far end. The light flickered erratically, casting jittery shadows that made the space feel smaller than it was. Pepper slowed down, her ears flicking back as she sniffed the air. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought they were people. 2 figures standing at the far end of the alley, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight. They were tall, easily over 6 feet, and broad, their shoulders hunched forward like they were leaning into the wind. But the longer I stared, the more wrong they looked. Their arms were too long, their movements too jerky, like marionettes being yanked along by invisible strings. My stomach dropped. They weren't people. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over bulging muscles. They were hairless, their heads misshapen, and their eyes, God, their eyes. Hollow dark pits that seemed to drink in the faint light, making the shadows around them ripple unnaturally. Pepper froze, her little body trembling as a low, guttural growl escaped her throat. I'd never heard her make a sound like that before. My feet felt glued to the ground, my mind screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. The figures shifted, their heads tilting in perfect unison as they turned to look directly at me. The way they moved made my skin crawl. Their steps were slow, deliberate, and wrong, like they were mimicking the way humans walked, but didn't quite understand how. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the narrow alley, wet and heavy, like flesh slapping against concrete. "Pepper," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "Let's go." But she wouldn't budge. Her growling turned into frantic barking, high-pitched and desperate, as the figures continued their slow advance. My legs finally obeyed, and I yanked hard on the leash, scooping her up as I stumbled backward. My breath came in ragged gasps, my eyes locked on the figures as they moved closer. One of them stopped under the streetlight, its pale skin glowing faintly in the flickering light. It raised a hand, long, spindly fingers, twitching like it was trying to reach for something it couldn't quite grasp. The other figure paused, then turned its head toward the shadows on my left, as if it had heard something. I followed its gaze and immediately wished I hadn't. A third figure stepped out from the darkness, larger than the other 2, its movements smoother, more confident. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. This one was different. It didn't shuffle or jerk like the others. It moved with purpose. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house. My legs burned, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. But I didn't stop until I was inside. The door locked and bolted behind me. Pepper squirmed in my arms, still barking furiously as I collapsed onto the floor. Roscoe was on his feet, his growls deep and resonant, his eyes fixed on the windows. I crawled over and shut the curtains, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the fabric. The house felt suffocating, the air heavy with a smell I couldn't quite place. Damp earth and something metallic, like blood. I sat there on the floor, clutching Pepper as Roscoe barked at the door. Outside I could hear faint wet footsteps on the pavement. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Then they stopped, and the tapping began. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I heard the tapping, faint but deliberate, like fingernails on glass. Sometimes it was at the windows. Sometimes it was at the walls. Always in a slow, maddening rhythm. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but Roscoe's growling and Pepper's trembling told me otherwise. Whatever was out there wasn't leaving. When dawn finally broke, the tapping stopped. The house fell silent, but the air felt just as heavy, like it was saturated with something unseen. I waited until the light spilled fully into the room before daring to open the curtains. The yard looked normal at first. The patchy grass, the leaning fence, the lone tree in the corner. It was all exactly as it should be. But then I saw the marks on the door. Deep gouges crisscrossed the wood. The kind you'd expect from claws or a blade. They hadn't been there the night before. My stomach churned as I stepped outside for a closer look. The air smelled faintly of rot, a stench that made my throat tighten. The ground beneath the windows was disturbed, the dirt scuffed and scattered. At first I thought it was just from animals, but then I noticed the footprints. They were huge, far larger than any animal I'd seen. The shape was all wrong, too. The impressions were wide, with long, clawed toes that dug deep into the earth. I squatted down, pressing my hand into one of the prints. It dwarfed my palm. My pulse quickened as my gaze landed on something else, symbols carved into the dirt. They were crude and jagged, like someone had dragged a stick or a claw through the soil. Swirls and lines that didn't make sense but felt deliberate, intentional. I didn't want to look at them any longer. I grabbed Roscoe's leash, muttered something reassuring to myself, and headed for the neighbor's house. If anyone would know what to make of this, it was old Mr. Larkin. Mr. Larkin had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. He was the kind of guy who knew everyone's business, whether you wanted him to or not. When I explained what I'd seen, leaving out the worst of it, of course, his face went pale. "You saw them, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands shook as he set down his coffee mug. "The pale ones." I frowned. "The what?" "They don't come around often," he continued, his eyes darting toward the window. "Only in the fall, when the nights get long. They're not animals, not people either. Something else, something old." His words didn't make sense, but the fear in his voice was undeniable. He warned me to avoid the woods, and to keep the curtains drawn after dark. "And don't let them mark you," he added cryptically. "If they do, they'll never stop." I left his house with more questions than answers, my mind racing. Mark me? What did that even mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. Back at home, I grabbed Roscoe's leash and decided to retrace my steps from the night before. It felt reckless, but I needed answers. The alley where I'd seen the creatures looked normal in the daylight, though the flickering streetlight at the far end was now shattered. Glass littered the ground, catching the weak sunlight. Roscoe was restless, pulling against the leash as we walked. I kept my eyes on the ground, scanning for any sign of the creatures. But all I found were more of those strange symbols, etched into the dirt in long, looping patterns that seemed to lead toward the woods. We didn't make it far. Roscoe froze, growling low in his throat, his body rigid as a board. He wouldn't move, wouldn't even look at me. His eyes were locked on the shadowy tree line ahead. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just the dark outlines of trees, their branches swaying in the breeze. Still, I felt it. That oppressive weight in the air, the same feeling I'd had the night before. We turned back. That night, the tapping returned. It started softly, just a faint click-click-click against the window. I stayed in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife like it would do any good. Roscoe sat by the door, growling steadily, while Pepper hid under the couch. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just the wind. But then I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like wet flesh slapping against concrete. My stomach tightened as the footsteps circled the house, pausing every few feet before starting again. I held my breath as something scraped against the front door. Long, slow drags that sent shivers up my spine. Roscoe lunged at the door, barking furiously. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. And then came the voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over Roscoe's barking, a low guttural whisper that didn't sound human. It called my name, not once, but twice. Drawn out, distorted, like someone trying to mimic a voice they didn't quite understand. I didn't wait to hear it a third time. Grabbing both dogs, I bolted for the garage. My car keys were already in my pocket, and I fumbled to get the door open. The dogs scrambled inside as I started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of them in the rearview mirror. 3 figures stood at the edge of the yard, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. One of them raised a hand, its fingers twitching unnaturally, almost like it was waving goodbye. I didn't look back. I knew this trip was going to be different the moment we rolled up to that campsite. The place was massive. So big that before we arrived, nobody had fully mapped it out. Normally we do a thorough sweep to mark any hazards, and figure out where mischievous kids might wander. This time the size alone made that impossible, and it put me on edge. The kids, of course, found it all thrilling. They asked a million questions, buzzing with that bright-eyed energy that only comes from fresh air and the promise of running around unsupervised. Well, mostly unsupervised. We pitched our tents in a clearing that looked reasonably safe, at least by daylight. The biggest worry I had at the time was a random root or hole someone might trip over. Still, something gnawed at me. I'd catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shadows dancing just beyond the tree line. Once or twice, I turned too quickly, expecting to see an animal darting away, but nothing. I told myself I was just tired, or maybe feeling jumpy about the unknown. That evening, we gathered the kids to explain our big tradition, the night game. Typical camp scarefest. Each adult leader dons some haphazard monster costume, positions themselves along a designated path, and leaps out at unsuspecting 8 to 10-year-olds. You know, the kind of thing that always gets them shrieking, then giggling like crazy. But as I handed out flashlights and set the ground rules, like, absolutely don't leave the trail unless you want to end up lost for hours, I felt my nerves cranking up another notch. I tried to hide it behind a grin. I chose this open patch of forest to do my part. It was ideal for breaking into a sprint whenever I spotted a group approaching, barely any underbrush or brambles. But with no bushes or rocks to hide behind, I had to switch off my flashlight or risk blowing my cover. The darkness there felt thicker somehow, almost suffocating. Several times I swore I saw a figure my size slip between the trees. Each time I flicked on my light, expecting to catch one of the other leaders pulling a fast one on me. Not once did I see a single soul. Right when I was about ready to call it a night, I glimpsed someone near a large trunk. At first, relief rushed through me. Finally, I'd caught my prankster in the act. I flipped on the beam to let them know they were busted. But what the light showed was all wrong. Whoever stood there wore a tattered burlap sack, stained dark in patches, and had a bunch of plastic bags wrapped around their head like a makeshift hood. The person's arms and legs were caked in dried mud, and there was this repeated sound like a gentle knocking. It took me a second to realize he was tapping his forehead into the tree trunk, over and over. I tried calling out. Maybe it was a messed up costume or somebody fooling around. But he didn't answer. He just paused that head tapping and turned in my direction, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. Something told me this was no friend. My whole body launched into action before my mind fully processed what was happening. I tore away from that clearing, branches snapping under my shoes, leaves rustling as I barreled through like a runaway train. Anytime I thought I was safe, I heard footfalls behind me, quick and heavy. I refused to look back. I was convinced if I did, I'd run straight into a tree or fall face first into the dirt. The only thought rattling around in my head was, get back to camp, get to the others, get to the light. When I burst into the campfire glow, the other leaders stared at me like I was out of my mind. They were all accounted for, masks off, sipping water, looking as calm as ever. I could barely catch my breath. No one else seemed winded, let alone coated in filth or wearing anything like that hideous burlap getup. They tried reassuring me, saying maybe I'd just spotted a trick of moonlight, or a wandering camper from another group. As much as I wanted to believe that, I knew I'd seen something. It was enough to keep me up half the night, ears straining for any sound that hinted we weren't alone in that massive stretch of forest. The morning came way too early. I dragged myself out of my sleeping bag, half expecting to see the rest of the group gossiping about my late-night meltdown. But most of them were already busy corralling the kids for breakfast. Nobody was pointing fingers or making jokes, yet. Still, I knew I couldn't just brush off what happened. Maybe there was a dangerous stranger out there, a lost hiker who needed help, or something worse. I cornered one of the other leaders, a friend who'd known me long enough to trust I wasn't making up tall tales. I laid it all out. The ragged burlap, the plastic around the head, the frantic chase through the trees. Her eyes got bigger with every detail, and I could see a flicker of worry replace her usual calm. We decided to sneak off after the kids were occupied with arts and crafts. No sense in alerting them, or risking a full-blown panic. Walking back into the woods felt like stepping into a different world. In daylight, the place looked calmer, but I still couldn't shake the tension winding itself around my nerves. Every snapped twig made me jerk my head around. Every brush of a branch against my sleeve had me bracing to run again. My friend tried to keep conversation light, talking about mundane stuff just to fill the silence. But my focus was on that clearing, the exact spot where I'd seen him. When we finally found the tree, I recognized it by a jagged chunk of bark near the base, a detail I'd noticed only because I'd briefly shown my flashlight there the night before. There weren't obvious footprints or signs of a struggle, which was odd considering all the thrashing around I'd done. For a second, I worried I'd dragged my friend out here for nothing, letting my own nerves spin a wild story. But then we spotted it. A rabbit nailed to the trunk, skinned and rotting in the heat. The stench was indescribable, some foul mix of decay and dried blood. My friend recoiled, swearing softly under her breath. I felt like my insides twisted into a knot. Anyone who'd do something like that wasn't just a prankster with a sick sense of humor. They were straight up disturbing. We called the police using the camp's ancient radio phone, which crackled so badly I had to repeat myself 3 times. Eventually, 2 officers rolled up, neither looking thrilled about trudging into the woods. We showed them the gruesome scene, half expecting them to share our alarm. Instead, they shrugged and suggested it might be some teenagers from a nearby town or rival scouting group playing a gross joke. They took a couple of photos, wrote a few notes, and promised to look into it. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. I helped the kids make nature collages and watched them run relay races, always keeping an ear out for odd sounds beyond the tree line. Every rustle of branches had me on edge, imagining burlap and plastic lurking just out of sight. The other leaders noticed my jumpiness but didn't press. Maybe they sensed how seriously rattled I was. No more sightings came. No screeching from a stranger in the woods. No footprints leading into our camp. Part of me felt relief, but another part grew more uneasy, wondering where that person went and if they'd resurface when we least expected it. That final night, none of us slept well, though we did our best to pretend we were just excited to go home. As we packed the vans the next morning, the kids were all smiles, talking about their favorite memories, s'mores, night games, bunking together under a star-studded sky. I plastered on a grin, offering encouraging nods every time they asked if we'd be back soon. But in the back of my mind, the image of that skinned rabbit and the person wrapped in plastic lingered. It was like a warning, etched into my thoughts. Some places hide things in their deepest corners that no one should ever stumble upon. Even when we finally drove away, I couldn't relax. Every bump in the road echoed with the possibility of something sinister. We left the forest behind, but I had this gnawing certainty that whatever lurked there wasn't done roaming its territory. And I promised myself that if I ever found out what, or who, it was, I'd be a whole lot more prepared next time. I always used to roll my eyes at ghost stories and all those things that go bump in the night. Growing up in a small Utah town, though, you start to realize that the landscape can play tricks on you. My house sat right where the building stopped and the wilderness began. Beyond our backyard fence was just this enormous field, stretching on forever until the desert touched distant mountains. On some days, you could see dust devils spinning across the flat earth like they had a mind of their own. Living there felt like living at the boundary between normal life and the unknown. My best friend lived next door, though next door was really just across a patch of wild grass. Our homes formed the last 2 spots of civilization on this lonely street, which ended in an empty cul-de-sac. As far as anyone could tell, the town had planned to expand at some point, but they never got around to it, so the cul-de-sac sat forgotten, half carved into the dirt. It was high school, and I spent more time at my friend's place than my own. His basement was our hideout, a tattered old couch, a TV that barely worked, and a mini fridge usually stocked with soda and leftovers. The window well in that basement was the only view outside, but it was a comfort. Until nights fell, and it turned into a black void that made us both feel uneasy. Every so often, we'd be in the middle of a late-night gaming marathon when a noise drifted through that window. A slow, scraping shuffle, mixed with something like a gargling cough. The first time it happened, we paused the game, stared at each other, and thought maybe it was just the wind blowing trash around. Then it happened again, another night, and it started to feel too deliberate to be the wind. Neither of us had the nerve to walk upstairs and fling open the back door, so we just sat there, telling each other it had to be animals, or who knows what. But there was a tension growing between us. Neither of us believed the excuses. We tried shining flashlights through the glass once. Nothing jumped out, but the beam caught hints of movement, the kind that makes you question if your eyes are messing with you. The next morning, we looked for tracks in the mud, convinced we'd find some stray dogs' footprints. Or maybe raccoon tracks. Something normal. But the ground was smooth, disturbed only by random patches of weeds. That was when the question lodged itself in my brain. If there was nothing back there, what made the noise? Time wore on, and the weird occurrences became part of our routine. Like how you eventually stop reacting to a house settling in the middle of the night. We kept living our lives, shrugging it off as coincidence. But each time I headed home through that empty field, the air felt heavy, as if the dusty ground was concealing a secret just out of sight. When the wind blew across those low bushes, it sounded more like hushed whispers than just leaves rustling. My friend was getting ready to move soon. His parents were taking him to another part of the state. We spent our last few weeks of freedom soaking up every bit of fun we could. A nagging voice in my head told me something was looming, like the field itself was waiting for the perfect moment to prove us right about our fears. The final days felt electric, as if the nights had gotten darker and the quiet had grown a little too thick. We were both on edge, though we hardly admitted it. One evening, I stepped out onto his back porch to grab something from the truck, and the sight of the empty cul-de-sac struck me in a way it never had before. The street lamp at the end of the road was broken, leaving that corner in pitch-black darkness. There was a feeling, almost like the darkness was crawling closer, pressing on the edges of our property. I hurried back inside, acting like I was just cold, but really, I couldn't stand being out there any longer than I had to. Little did I know, that creeping sense of dread was only the beginning. There were still more odd happenings to come, nights of uneasy sleep and half-imagined shapes at the window. I tried to laugh it off, but that place had a hold on me. It was like an ancient desert creature, biding its time, letting the moonless nights build an atmosphere of tension that no amount of logical thinking could dismantle. And if I'd known what was waiting for us on the other side of that pitch-black field, I might have never left that basement at all. I had no idea how quickly things could escalate until the night my friend and I decided to go for one last drive through that dusty cul-de-sac. He was days away from moving, and we were both restless. The thought of staying in that basement had started making my stomach churn, so we figured a bit of fresh air might calm our nerves, or at least distract us. We climbed into his old truck around midnight, cranking the engine in the kind of silence only broken by our jittery breathing. When we pulled out of the driveway, we flicked on the high beams, and I spotted a rabbit darting off into the field. That tiny movement reminded me how alive the darkness could be. We turned the wheel toward the empty roundabout, thinking we'd make a quick loop back onto the main street. That stretch of pavement was practically abandoned. No lights, no houses, just a half circle of asphalt leading into a wall of brush and sage. As soon as the headlights cut across the dirt, we both locked onto something hunched low in the beam. At first, my eyes struggled to make sense of the shape. It looked vaguely human, but not quite. Pale limbs jutted out at angles that didn't seem right, each joint too long, too gaunt. And the skin, thin and almost translucent, clung to its frame like it had been plastered on. Neither of us spoke. The truck idled, headlights illuminating this figure in a stark white glow. Every cell in my body begged me to blink, to look away, but I couldn't. The thing's head swiveled toward us, revealing an open mouth stretched far beyond normal. It reminded me of a snake dislocating its jaw, except there was no visible tongue, no teeth I could make out, just a dark hollow. Then there were the eyes, black and almost reflective, as if they soaked up the truck's headlights. A bolt of panic shot through me. The thing jerked backward, contorting itself in a way that defied simple physics. It zipped into the brush, almost as if someone had hit rewind. We stayed put, gripping the wheel and the passenger seat, trying to piece together what we'd just seen. That half-second felt like it lasted an hour, and yet the moment was gone before we could react. My friend slammed the truck into reverse. There was no debate, no words exchanged. He just gunned it. We tore out of that cul-de-sac, gravel spraying against the undercarriage. The whole time, I had this urge to twist around and check the rear window. I was too afraid of seeing another glimpse of that pale form lunging after us. When we made it back to his place, we jumped out of the truck and sprinted inside. Neither of us wasted time fumbling with the lights. We flipped on every switch we could reach, checking windows, peering through the blinds. The house felt too quiet, like the air had been drained out of the rooms. We double-locked the back door and huddled in the basement, the place that had once been our cozy refuge, now feeling like a bunker. For hours we just sat there, occasionally whispering possibilities. Was it a person, starving and sick? Some kind of animal with mange? But none of that explained the unnatural angles of its limbs, or the gaping jaw that looked like a black pit. At one point, I thought I heard a shuffling noise above us, but I couldn't be certain if it was just the house settling, or my imagination running wild. We kept the TV on low, more for noise than anything else, but every so often we'd mute it, convinced something outside had moved. We never could bring ourselves to open the basement window, even though part of me wanted to check that empty field and see if it was still lurking. Caution won out. I wasn't in a hurry to come face to face with that creature again. Eventually, the sun started to rise, leaking weak orange light into the basement. The moment we saw the first glow, we exhaled relief we hadn't known we were holding in. The new day offered a layer of safety, making the events of the night feel strangely dreamlike. My friend packed a few more things, and as he loaded them into his truck, he paused in the yard. I caught him staring at the cul-de-sac, probably thinking the same thing I was. Would we ever figure out what had been skulking out there? He drove away 2 days later, leaving me to face a weird mix of emptiness and lingering dread whenever I glanced out toward those fields. For a while, I tried to dismiss the memory of that night as a trick of fear and headlights. But whenever I passed that spot, where the asphalt ended and the desert began, the memory resurfaced, sharp and vivid. The possibility that the thing might still be waiting behind the brush never felt far-fetched anymore. A few months after he left, I left too, heading off to chase my own future. But whenever I come back to visit, those fields remain exactly the same. I'll drive by slowly, resisting the urge to scan the shadows, convinced that if I look too long, I might see a flash of pale skin, bony limbs, and that hollow grin. And no matter how much time passes, that possibility keeps me from feeling truly safe in the place I once called home. I remember paddling onto the shore of Little Triscuit as dusk settled in, feeling more worn out than usual. The day had been relentless, miles of open water, the sun beating down without mercy. Still, guiding trips at Lake of the Woods always brought a strange mix of excitement and wariness. Maybe it was the way the endless trees crowded the shoreline, or how legends around this place never stopped swirling among those who'd been here long enough. Whatever it was, I carried an edge of nervous energy with me as I helped unload the canoes. My co-guide, Jordan, and I had 7 campers with us, ranging from 12 to 17. One of them, let's call him Mark, rarely spoke in full sentences. When he did, the words sometimes tumbled out like he'd been bottling them up for days. I admired his determination to keep pace with everyone, but there was a look on his face that evening, almost like he wanted to tell me something, and couldn't quite get it out, while the others set up the tents and tried to scrape mud off their boots. I walked the perimeter of the campsite, taking note of the thick undergrowth beyond the fire pit. My gut told me to keep an eye on that shadowy border. Sunlight was fading fast, and the forest seemed to fold in around us. The moment I turned back to the main site, I spotted Mark standing at the edge of the trees, squinting into the dimness. "Who is that man?" he asked, voice flat. I stopped in my tracks and looked where he was pointing. No one was there except Jordan, busy tying down a canoe. I called out, "Mark, it's just us, buddy," and glanced around for any shape or movement. Nothing. We counted everyone, still 7 campers present. Mark just kept staring though, like he expected something to step out from behind a trunk at any second. Jordan caught sight of our uneasy conversation, and ambled over. I filled him in quickly, and we both assured Mark that maybe he was seeing a trick of the light. Mark didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. With everyone's stomachs growling, we decided to shift focus to dinner. We gathered around the campfire, the warmth of the flames cutting through the cool air. A few of the boys tried to lighten the mood by laughing at their own unfunny jokes, while our lone girl, Becca, stayed quietly by her tent. I felt a slight tension whenever someone glanced toward the tree line, especially Mark. It wasn't as if we'd actually seen anything, but the atmosphere felt heavy, like the forest was listening to every word. By the time we finished eating, darkness had swallowed the last traces of twilight. The lake glimmered under the moonlight, but the woods behind us looked like a solid wall. The group was spent. One by one, the kids peeled off to their tents. Jordan and I settled into ours, mentally ticking off safety measures before trying to rest. Hours later, or maybe it was just a long half hour, my eyes snapped open at the sound of Becca's voice. "Stop," she called, sounding annoyed. It came from a few yards away, where her tent was pitched. My pulse hammered as I scrambled for a flashlight. Jordan fumbled with the zipper and yelled back, "Becca, everything okay?" She didn't answer for what felt like an eternity, then muttered something we couldn't catch. We unzipped our tent and poked our heads out. Every other tent was zipped tight, no one wandering around. The breeze had vanished, leaving the campsite unnervingly silent. Finally, Becca's voice came again, low and shaky. "I thought you two were shaking my tent." Jordan and I looked at each other in confusion. We hadn't so much as budged since turning in. No one else had crawled out of their tents. I would have heard or seen a flashlight. Trying not to sound too freaked, I said, "We've been here the whole time." After that, Becca went quiet. The rest of the night passed without further commotion, but I doubt anyone slept well. Next morning, I expected everyone to be relieved in the broad daylight. Instead, nervous chatter replaced the usual morning groans about aches and pains from sleeping on the ground. Becca emerged from her tent flushed with frustration. "Look," she said, brandishing a bent tent stake in my face. I took it from her, puzzling over how it ended up twisted at a neat right angle. She had another one just like it. They were sturdy metal stakes, the kind that usually survive years of windstorms without bending. Jordan and I tried forcing one back into shape, but it may as well have been made of reinforced steel. It wouldn't budge. Becca insisted something had yanked on her tent, forcing the stakes to bend. She joked nervously that maybe she'd pitched her tent on top of an angry chipmunk den. Nobody really laughed. Breakfast tasted bland, even though I used the last of our precious cinnamon to spice up oatmeal. Everyone was eager to hit the canoes. Whatever happened here in the night, nobody wanted to stick around and find out if it would happen again. We double-checked our gear, then shoved off into the calm water. I glanced back over my shoulder at little Trisket, heart in my throat, half expecting to see a figure watching from the tree line. But there was just the dim shape of our campfire's ashes and a few drifting wisps of smoke. Jordan paddled alongside me, expression tense. We didn't say much. Even the kids, who usually bickered over who was the fastest, kept their voices low. Part of me tried to shrug it all off. Maybe it was just bizarre luck. Maybe we were all spooked by some trick of the light. But part of me couldn't shake the sense that little Trisket wasn't a place you leave entirely behind. I kept that thought to myself for the moment, silently hoping that the next campsite would bring only ordinary wilderness troubles. Inside, though, I was already bracing for whatever else Lake of the Woods might have up its sleeve. By the time we finally shoved off from Little Triscuit, the sky felt lighter, like we were leaving something behind in those tangled trees. Of course, none of us actually said that out loud. We just paddled, letting the kids' chatter fill the stillness. Every so often, Jordan and I exchanged glances that said, "Are we really done with all that?" Neither of us wanted to be the first to admit our nerves were still jangling. For the next couple of days, our group followed the usual canoe trail through smaller islands and calm coves. The mornings rolled by uneventfully. The kids sang rowing songs, teased each other about who needed more sunscreen, and occasionally complained about sore muscles. At night, though, my mind drifted back to those bent stakes, the trembling tent, things that didn't add up no matter how I tried to rationalize them. I caught Jordan scanning the tree lines more than once, as if half expecting some pale figure to glide into view. On the third day after leaving Little Triscuit, we found a scenic campsite on the opposite side of the lake. It had a more open clearing, so at least we weren't surrounded by walls of undergrowth this time. The kids seemed relieved. They even built a small rock circle for the fire, humming pop tunes like they were back in civilization. At first I tried to match their mood, but each flicker of the flames made me remember the hush that fell over our group that first night, when Mark claimed he saw a man in the woods. That evening, the silence came down heavier than before. The wind died off, leaving the water still as glass. Once dinner ended, a couple of the kids tried to break the tension by telling jokes, but even those fizzled out. Jordan finally decided to spin one of the local legends, something about sightings of a gaunt shape roaming these shores, rumored to appear if you doubted its existence. The kids listened wide-eyed, glancing at the forest and the quiet water. I considered cutting him off, but he was already in full storyteller mode, describing how people sometimes woke to find their gear torn or footprints circling their tents. By the time he finished, every crackle of burning wood made the group jump. Mark, usually so quiet, spoke up then, murmuring about how the white shape only comes when people disrespect it. His voice was so subdued that everyone had to lean in. It felt like an echo from Little Triscuit, and the memory left a knot in my chest. The rest of the night passed uneasily. I found myself jolting awake at every rustle beyond my tent, listening for footsteps that never came. A couple more days later, we finally made our way back to base camp. Seeing the row of cabins and hearing the bustle of other campers relaxed me a little, like stepping back into a world that obeyed normal rules. The kids scattered to retrieve their duffel bags, grinning at the promise of clean showers and phone signals. Jordan and I began our usual routine of hauling canoes onto racks and logging any equipment damage. But my mind was still replaying everything. Mark's warnings, the bent metal, Becca's shaken tent. Not long after we returned, I ran into a friend, another guide who'd stayed at Little Triscuit the night after us. I asked her how the trip had gone, and she blurted out a strange story about seeing a tall, pale figure in the woods, while she was off finding a private spot to use the bathroom. She assumed it was some camper wandering too close, but when she got back, everyone insisted they'd been by the fire the whole time. I felt my stomach lurch. It was more or less the same thing we'd experienced. Someone or something lurking where it had no business being. That afternoon, word spread around camp about my conversation with her. Other guides tossed in their stories, each one more unnerving than the last. Footprints leading right to a tent door. Bizarre tapping on canvas in the dead of night. Muffled sounds echoing through the trees. One guy even swore he saw a faint shape slip into the water near an island rumored to be haunted. The common thread in all these tales was that once people returned to base camp, the weirdness stopped. It was almost like the forest itself refused to let outsiders scoff at its presence. I can't say I felt relief or terror as I listened to everyone's accounts. More a grim sense of acceptance. I realized that what happened to us wasn't just a fluke. Nobody used the word Wendigo openly, not in any serious way, but the older guides hinted at it in hushed tones. They'd shake their heads and say, "It's best to respect what you don't understand." Over the next few days, My thoughts kept drifting back to that night with the shaking tent and the twisted stakes, or to how Mark pointed straight into the darkness, convinced he saw a person out there. Sleep was erratic. Even casual noises, doors slamming or equipment rattling, made me think about snapping branches and hush-blanketed forests. Jordan and I tried to joke it off, but I could tell he was just as unsettled. At some point, I stood alone by the base camp canoe racks, and let my eyes wander across the horizon, where the lake merged with endless evergreens. Part of me wondered if I should take another trip out there, just to prove I wasn't spooked beyond reason. But another part of me answered, maybe give it time, and make sure you tread lightly if you ever go back. Right before heading in for the night, I glimpsed something along the tree line. Could have been just a shadow. Another guide waved me over to help with gear, and when I glanced back, nothing was there. I told myself it was a trick of the fading light. Still, an uneasy knot remained in my gut. The sense that something in those woods keeps its own watch, follows its own rules, and isn't keen on giving up its secrets. And I couldn't decide if I was more afraid of running into it again, or never knowing what was truly there in the first place. I swear I could feel the tension in the air the moment we hauled that gear onto the boat. The sun was just barely waking up, painting the sky in soft streaks of orange and pink as my dad and my brother wordlessly slid the boat into the water. Normally I would have been brimming with excitement for a trip like this, deep in northern Canada, searching for moose in a place that barely knew a human footprint. But something about that morning put me on edge. It was too quiet, too still. We spent hours gliding through winding rivers that twisted around thick walls of forest. Every so often, we'd have to stop at a cluster of rapids, lug our boat and supplies over slick rocks, then push forward again. My brother would occasionally crack a half joke about my scrawny arms not being up to the task, but there was an uneasy note to his voice. I just forced a laugh, pretending everything was fine. By late afternoon, it felt like the wind itself had abandoned us. We found a patch of muddy riverbank to set up camp. I remember letting out a relieved sigh as we anchored the boat and offloaded our gear. The forest around us loomed with silhouettes that almost looked like watchful figures. Like the trees themselves were sizing us up. My dad shrugged it off when I tried to mention it. He just muttered about how we had to finish pitching the tent before we lost the last bit of daylight. When we finally settled by our modest campfire, my brother's usual chatter fell oddly flat. I tried asking him if he'd noticed anything strange while we were on the water, but he just shook his head and poked at the embers with a stick. Maybe he wanted to ignore it. Maybe I was being dramatic. But every now and then, I caught him glancing over his shoulder, checking the dark edges of the camp, as if expecting something to be there. Eventually, both my dad and brother decided to turn in for the night. I felt too restless, too uneasy to sleep. I told myself I'd collect more firewood, maybe shake off the day's weird energy. The campfire's glow only stretched so far, and as I moved beyond it, the air seemed to thicken. There was an odor, faint but nauseating, like expired food. My head felt light, like I couldn't quite keep my balance on the uneven ground. I crouched to pick up a stray branch, and that's when I caught a flicker of movement along the tree line. Something rustled. My heart hammered in my ears, a deep thrumming that drowned out every other sound around me. The moon was faint, just enough to tease shapes out of the darkness. I squinted, trying to see past a cluster of branches. It looked like they were bending, almost shifting in a way that resembled a face. My mind churned with explanations, maybe a trick of shadows, maybe a deer turning its head. But as I watched, that shape began to look disturbingly human. A voice drifted out from the dimness, startling me. It was warm, too warm, calling my name like it belonged to someone I loved. A voice I recognized immediately, but the relative it belonged to had been dead for months. My stomach lurched. Logic said this was impossible. Yet my feet inched forward. There was a gentle, pleading tone in that voice, asking me to come closer, that it missed me. My chest tightened with a flood of conflicting emotions. This was comforting and terrifying all at once. Everything changed in a single beat. The shape that had formed that too familiar face shifted. The skin, or whatever was imitating skin, started to peel, revealing a grotesque smear of muscle and bone. The mouth, once smiling, went slack. An overwhelming sense of alarm burned through me. I realized I had wandered far from the fire's protective glow. Whatever this thing was, it abandoned its facade and snarled, commanding me to move deeper into the dark. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my grip on the branches in my hand. I forced my body around and sprinted toward camp, but I heard it crashing behind me. The wild beating in my chest roared in my ears. The embankment leading up to the camp felt like a mile-high wall. I scrambled on all fours trying to climb. That's when it seized my ankle with a force that felt inhuman. A choked sound escaped my mouth at first, useless. Then, driven by pure desperation, I found my voice and managed a ragged scream for help, praying my dad or brother would hear. Suddenly, my brother appeared at the top of the slope, his eyes wide as he grabbed my arms and yanked me with everything he had. I could sense the creature's grip slipping, could practically feel the anger radiating from it in that final moment before it let go. We tumbled onto the dirt, gasping for air. My dad came racing out of the tent, rifle in hand, barking questions. Through shattered breaths, I tried describing what I saw, what I thought I saw. My brother cut me off with a quick nod, muttering that he caught a glimpse of it too. That confirmation, he saw it, froze my blood. I wanted to believe I was just hallucinating, but now there was no denying something nightmarish was out there. We stayed close to the fire, rifles drawn, scanning the edge of the woods for any sign of movement. The rest of the night stretched on like it would never end, every second charged with the fear of another attack. In the smoldering embers' glow, I couldn't get that rotting face out of my mind. An echo of a loved one's voice twisting into something monstrous. I had no idea if we'd truly escaped or if the worst was yet to come. I'd never felt so alive and so afraid at the same time. My chest was still hammering from the encounter by the riverbank, and as I stumbled back toward the fire with my brother's help, every shadow seemed ready to lash out again. My dad rushed over, rifle in hand, eyes darting from me to the dark tree line. I tried to explain, but my thoughts came out in jagged fragments. Something about a rotting face, torn skin, a voice that never should have spoken again. When I finally blurted that it sounded like our dead relative, the words tasted foul. Yet the worst part was that my brother nodded, confirming he'd caught a glimpse of the same horror. That small gesture meant there was no more pretending I'd imagined it. We crowded around the fire, almost huddling in a circle with our guns laid out within reach. The crackling flames were our only comfort, but they felt so fragile in that vast darkness. The silence was so heavy that every pop of burning wood made me jolt. My dad kept his gaze fixed on the tree line, scanning left and right, as if daring that thing to make a move. And the smell, the rancid, putrid stench that clung to the air, never faded. It drifted in and out as though something unholy was circling just beyond what the firelight revealed. Time dragged in that suffocating vigil. My brother and I didn't dare speak above a whisper, if at all. Every so often I swore I saw a tall silhouette flicker beyond the reach of the flames. It would stand there, looming, but when I'd blink or shift my angle, it vanished. I started to question my own eyes, my own sanity. Maybe it was just the aftershock of terror, but then my brother gripped his gun tighter, confirming he saw it too. We never did get a clear look. Part of me was thankful for that. I don't think I could handle seeing its face a second time. By the time the sky began to lighten, I felt half crazed with exhaustion. My eyes burned from keeping them open all night. But none of us had dared to sleep, not even for a moment. The embers of the fire were low, and the cold morning air made my breath rise in tense little clouds. I couldn't wait to pack up and tear away from that cursed spot. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to slip up. We broke camp with a kind of frantic efficiency I'd never seen before. My dad barked orders about rolling up sleeping bags and tossing them onto the boat. My brother didn't even crack a joke, his usual way of coping. He had this grim, distant look, as if he was already rehearsing a story he didn't want to share. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that if I let my guard down for a second, that thing would lunge at me again. The stench still lingered in my nostrils, and I felt like my lungs couldn't draw in a full breath. When we finally shoved off, I could barely feel my hands. They trembled around the paddle, my palms slippery with sweat. The river seemed calmer than the day before, but I caught glimpses of motion along the banks, bony limbs darting between trees, or maybe just my imagination. Every time the boat scraped a shallow rock or driftwood, I panicked, thinking it was the creature grabbing hold again. My dad pressed us onward with a fierce urgency. We had to cover the distance back to civilization as fast as possible, or risk another night out here. Hours later, the scent of wood smoke and distant traffic lured us in, signs we were close to a small outpost. My entire body shook from the come-down, from that raw, gnawing terror. Yet the closer we got to actual homes and roads, the more my dread twisted into something else. A haunting certainty that I wouldn't truly leave this behind. I had no idea if that entity, or some piece of it, had followed us. There was no sense of safety in me, just a growing paranoia. Even back home, the nightmares took hold immediately. That very night, I jolted awake, convinced I heard shuffling footsteps on the porch, or scratching at my window. Sometimes, I'd dream of a half-decayed face calling me closer, rasping my name in a distorted version of my relative's voice. Morning would bring a flicker of relief, but it never lasted. Every knock on the door or rustle of wind made me jump. My brother wasn't any better off. He'd had the same kind of nightmares, though we didn't dare talk about it much. My dad, on the other hand, grew solemn, saying only that we mustn't breathe a word to anyone beyond a trusted few. He claimed nobody would believe us, and if they did, they'd call us reckless for wandering into places best left alone. Desperate for answers, we met with medicine men recommended by distant family friends. They performed rituals and offered small protective charms, sachets filled with herbs. For a few nights afterward, I managed to sleep a little longer before the nightmares got me. But that creeping feeling never went away. It clung to me like a damp chill, as though the entity had latched onto my spirit the moment it seized my leg. Finally, I chose to spill what I could to a couple of close friends. They gave me crystals, whispered about supernatural predators, and suggested I carry salt in my pockets whenever I headed out. I appreciated their concern, but I couldn't shake the sense that the only one who truly understood was my brother. Because he saw that thing too, if only for a split second. We all agreed to keep our story in a tight little circle. Part of it was shame, not wanting the label of crazy pinned on us. Part of it was guilt, like we'd trespassed somewhere we shouldn't have. And the forest spat back an unholy warning. Mostly, though, it was fear. Fear that in telling the story, we'd summon that decaying phantom all over again. Now, whenever I'm anywhere near the woods, I'm hyper-aware of every twig snap or drifting shadow. I never stand with my back to the trees anymore, because in the deepest part of my mind, I still smell that rancid stench and see a horrid grin under peeling skin, and I know it's out there, in one form or another, waiting for a moment of weakness. I made it out once, but something tells me this nightmare is far from over. I've been in this farmhouse my whole life, so nights out here usually feel familiar, almost comforting. You learn to tune out the usual creaks in the old wood, the distant lowing of cattle, and the soft chirping that drifts in through the windows. But that evening, something put me on edge. It started as I was going through my usual end-of-day routine. I was alone, so I felt a bit jumpier than usual. The living room lamp clicked off, leaving the space a lot darker than I remembered. The silence pressed in, and I headed to the front windows for my final pass, just to be sure everything was locked up. I nearly convinced myself I was being paranoid, when a faint glow caught my eye outside. At first I thought I was imagining it. 2 spots of light hovered near the tree line, too high off the ground to be a stray cat or a fox. I took off my glasses, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but they were gone. My brain scrambled to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe fireflies caught in a gust of wind, or a reflection of the moon on broken glass. Still, I made certain to lock every door and window before heading upstairs, heart thrumming a little harder than I'd care to admit. I didn't sleep well. Dawn arrived too fast, and I was already dragging myself out of bed to tend the animals. I hopped into my boots, stepped outside, and got hit with a stale, humid smell floating on the morning breeze. It felt wrong somehow, but I shoved that aside and focused on chores. My first stop was the barn. The horses were fine, just a bit restless. The real shock came when I checked on the cows. There were fewer than yesterday. I counted at least twice, but it didn't add up. Maybe I miscounted before, or maybe some had wandered off. That's when I noticed the fence. What used to be a sturdy section was torn and sagging, like something big and strong had barreled right through it. Splintered wood jutted at weird angles. I leaned in for a closer look and saw footprints in the dirt. They were strange, almost a hybrid shape, part hoof, part something else entirely. My family's taught me all about local wildlife, yet these tracks didn't match anything I'd seen or heard about. The uneasy feeling I'd had the night before started creeping back. I checked the rest of the property, finding no other clues, so I tried to move on, patching the fence as best I could until I had help. As the day dragged on, I found it tough to focus. My phone lit up with a text from my girlfriend, and the conversation blew up into a full-on fight. It left me tense and itching to clear my head. So after dusk, I grabbed my phone and headphones, heading off toward the forest. I've hiked it 1,000 times, but this was different. Something about the night air felt oppressive, like it was charged. I cranked up my music to overpower my thoughts and wandered deeper than I intended. Before I knew it, darkness was everywhere. I flipped on my phone's flashlight, sweeping it around. I caught the reflection of something that looked like eyes in the beam, high behind a tree. As soon as I angled my phone that way, the reflection vanished, leaving me reeling from a rush of panic. Maybe it was a trick of the light again, or maybe not. A growl rippled through the trees, low and ragged, unlike anything I'd heard in these woods. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I realized I had no clue where the path went. I started to backtrack, stumbling over roots and tangling my boots in undergrowth. My flashlight shook with each step. Then a sharp snap, like a branch being crushed underfoot, sounded close. Too close. Fear surged in my chest. I had to get out. My jog turned into a full-on sprint, branches slapping my face and arms. When I finally saw the farmhouse lights in the distance, I breathed a silent prayer of relief. I hopped the broken fence, nearly face-planting on the other side. Something moved at the tree line, tall, menacing, with eyes that gleamed faintly in the dark. A vile odor hit me, intense enough to make me gag. It never advanced. It just stood there, watching with a stillness that felt deliberate, like it was studying me. I forced myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart hammered as I peeked out a window, only to glimpse that pair of eyes still trained on me. Enough was enough. I yanked the blinds down, shut off every light, and made my way to my room, grabbing the old shotgun from my closet just to steady my nerves. That night, sleep was a distant thing. My thoughts were in a whirl, cows disappearing, fences torn, footprints with no reasonable explanation, and a hulking silhouette crouched at the edge of my land. I tried to convince myself I'd wake up and find a neat explanation, but I knew, deep down, that something big and unknown was stalking these woods. I woke the next morning with the shotgun still clutched in my arms, feeling like I'd only dozed off in brief intervals. The sun was out, but it did nothing to chase off the dread tightening my chest. I dragged myself outside to survey the damage. Sure enough, another cow was gone. The fencing I'd patched was shredded again. Splinters littered the ground, and I spotted crimson smears on the wire that looked too fresh to be old stains. There were footprints too, the kind I had no name for. Long, deformed impressions that seemed part hoof, part something far more disturbing. I forced myself deeper into the pasture, shotgun ready. It felt ridiculous, but every rustle in the grass, Every flutter of a bird made me jump. The forest stood ominously just beyond the fields, an unspoken invitation for this thing to come and go at will. Despite the daylight, I sensed I wasn't alone. Frustration and anger flared inside me. I'd lived here all my life, and no unknown creature was going to claim this land as a feeding ground. I mustered enough nerve to stand at the tree line, hollering into the undergrowth that I wasn't afraid. My voice shook, and the echo that returned from the stillness was unnerving. For a split second I thought I saw a black shape slip between the trunks, but whether it was the thing itself or just my imagination, I had no intention of finding out. I half-jogged back to the farmhouse, all the while feeling that same prickling sense of being watched. That afternoon, I did everything I could think of to prepare. I scavenged the barn for nails, boards, and tools, then rigged makeshift barricades on the windows. It felt a little excessive, but the memory of those eyes peering at me the night before kept me hammering away. I stacked furniture against certain doors I never used, bracing them from the inside. The place looked more like a fortress with each passing hour, and I hated that I needed this level of security in my own home. As dusk crept closer, I patrolled the house again, triple-checking every lock. The air outside turned heavy, and the wind rustled the dead leaves near the fence. It carried a faint, sickly smell that made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the sense that it was out there, sizing me up, waiting for darkness to hide its advance. Night finally fell, and with it, the usual forest noises vanished. No crickets, no frogs, just an unsettling quiet that set me on edge. My muscles tensed with every step across the old floorboards. I turned off most of the lights, leaving a few dim lamps so I could see if anything moved outside. My shotgun was within arm's reach, and I had a pistol holstered at my hip just in case. A few hours crawled by in suffocating silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd overdone it. That's when a sudden crash rattled the front door. The force behind the blow echoed through the house. My mouth went dry, and my heart thundered in my ears. Another crash. The door frame quaked, and I heard glass pop and skitter across the floor somewhere downstairs. A low roar rose from behind the walls, so feral and strange that I felt the vibrations in my chest. Something was forcing its way in, and my body reacted before my brain caught up. I snatched the shotgun and scrambled upstairs, nearly tripping on the last step. In the hallway, each footstep of the intruder felt heavier than any human's. The boards creaked as if under the weight of something colossal. An overpowering stench drifted toward me, thick enough to taste. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying not to retch. Then came the banging on the door to my room. Loud, rhythmic hits that shattered my nerve. Splinters of wood flew as I shouldered the door, shoving a dresser into place to buy a few seconds. The door buckled, and I finally caught sight of it. The crack between the door and frame gave me a horrible glimpse. Matted fur, something like a deer's skull topped with twisted antlers, but with patches of rotting skin clinging to it. My hands shook as I racked the shotgun's first shell. I aimed. The door burst open, sending shards of wood everywhere. I fired. The muzzle flash lit up the creature's hideous features. Empty eyes set in decaying sockets, an open maw with a jaw that seemed off-kilter. It let out a horrible screech that made me recoil, then lunged. I fired again, the recoil slamming back into my shoulder, but I refused to let go. The thing staggered, leaking a dark, foul substance that smelled like death. It howled, flailing those long limbs in fury. I kept my finger on the trigger, racking another shell, firing, and doing it again until I was spent. Each shot was deafening, and the house trembled with every roar from that abomination. Finally, it staggered backward, wheeling around in confusion. It tore down part of the hallway as it fled, smashing through walls and overturning furniture in its escape. I grabbed my pistol, sprinting after it down the stairs. My heart hammered, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The front door, the very one it had battered in, now stood ripped off its hinges. Outside, the shape lumbered across the yard. Its outline was monstrous, lit by a flickering porch light. With a trembling grip, I squeezed off a few rounds. The bullet seemed to do little more than anger it further. It whipped its head back, unleashing a final roar that reverberated off the barn, then bounded into the forest shadows. I wanted to chase it, but the rational side of me knew that was suicide. I called out a string of curses, equal parts terrified and furious, watching it vanish between the looming trees. Then there was sudden silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. Even the wind had died, leaving the yard unnaturally still. My front door was on the ground, the hinges twisted. Inside I discovered the windows, where I swore I'd heard glass explode, were strangely intact, as if reality had split for a moment, and then stitched itself back together, leaving evidence only in the wrecked wood and bullet casings scattered at my feet. I leaned against the splintered frame, shotgun and pistol hanging limply in my hands, trying to piece everything together. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, until I realized I had to come up with a believable story for my parents. There was no way to explain giant claw marks or bullet holes that made any sense. I finally decided to say I'd lost my temper during a personal crisis, blowing holes in the door myself. A story that wouldn't earn me any points, but at least it wouldn't brand me a lunatic. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but the house and yard were eerily calm. Stains on the floor had vanished. The only real reminder of the battle was my ruined door and the crippling weight in my chest. The phone rang soon after. My folks checking up on me. I lied as smoothly as I could about the door, promising to fix it before they got home. They threatened to ground me for the rest of my life, but that was a relief compared to explaining the truth. Time marched on, and I eventually left for college, but every so often I'd check in with my family, ask if the cows were all accounted for, if the fences were intact, if they'd heard any strange howls in the night. They'd brush it off as me worrying too much, but they didn't know the whole story. Part of me stayed convinced that whatever I fought off that night is still out there, licking its wounds, waiting. And the thought of going back to that farm alone still manages to send a sharp bolt of dread through my gut every time. I started out late, just a little after 10, and the sky was pouring rain like it was determined to drench every inch of Bucks County. Not the best conditions, but I'd driven these roads 100 times. I guess that's why I barely thought twice as I pulled onto the highway. Just the usual annoyance of wet tires and too few streetlights to really see more than a patch of asphalt ahead. The wipers were working overtime, swiping at the windshield so fast it was almost hypnotic. Part of me wanted to pull over and wait it out, but another part insisted I'd be fine. Besides, I was only about 45 minutes from home, and the idea of relaxing in my own bed kept me forging ahead. I shrugged off the creeping sense of dread, blaming it on the weather. A quarter hour into the drive, I found myself scanning the darkness on either side, maybe because I've seen deer dart out at the worst moments before. This time, though, I noticed something looming in my lane, way off in the distance. The shape seemed too big to be a normal deer. Way too tall, almost giraffe-like in the way it stretched upward. My pulse hammered at the base of my throat as I lifted my foot off the gas. I wondered if my eyes were just playing tricks, but it was definitely there, a shadow that swallowed any light from my high beams, refusing to reflect a single shimmer. I kept easing on the brakes, worried that a sudden stop might make me spin out. The car wobbled a bit, tires skidding on the slick surface. A few hundred feet away from this thing, I glanced down at my speedometer and realized I was going faster than I thought. Letting out a shaky breath, I gripped the wheel tighter, gearing up for an impact I half expected. I blinked rainwater from my lashes, forcing myself to keep my attention on the road. Getting closer, the figure started flickering at the edges like it couldn't decide whether to be there or not. Water pelted the windshield and the wipers made a groaning noise as they whipped back and forth, but somehow that shape stayed outside the range of my headlights. My vision blurred for a split second. I fiddled with the lever, turning the wipers to max, and still I couldn't get a clear view. Before I could comprehend it, the silhouette vanished. One moment, I was about to face down some huge creature. The next, I saw only empty asphalt glistening in the wet glare of my high beams. My shoes pressed harder on the brakes, and the car shuddered to a stop in the middle of the highway. I let out a ragged exhale, scanning the road ahead, the ditches on either side. Nothing. A car behind me honked far off, probably still a good distance away, so I tapped the gas and forced myself forward. Rain hammered against the roof, and I muttered a few curses under my breath, half convinced I'd imagined everything. That's when something smaller dashed right in front of my grill. There was no time to brace for impact. It popped into view and shot across the road in the blink of an eye. My chest tightened, ready for a thud, a lurch, anything. But I felt nothing. The road stayed clear, and the only sound was the whoosh of water under my tires. For a few seconds I thought I might be losing my mind. I eased the car down to a crawl, glancing in my rearview mirror, fully expecting to see a writhing body on the pavement. Still no sign of anything, no carcass, no shape scurrying off into the trees, nothing. It was like the road had swallowed it. The remaining half-hour home was a blur. Every flicker of movement, branches swaying, puddles splashing, made me jump. By the time I parked, my hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. I rushed inside and told the story to my boyfriend on the phone, practically tripping over my own words. He tried to calm me down, said maybe it was just the bad weather and my eyes playing tricks. But I could tell he was spooked by how shaken I sounded. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that towering silhouette, and the smaller phantom that zipped past my car. Normal deer sightings don't make me feel this unsteady. I had no idea what I'd run into out there, and the not knowing was the worst part. All I wanted was an explanation that made sense, but I also dreaded the thought that this was only the beginning of something bigger, and far more frightening. I woke up way too early, eyes gritty from a night of tossing and turning. Even in the bright morning light, I couldn't get rid of the images swirling in my head, those silhouettes that appeared and vanished during my drive. It had me on edge in a way I've never felt before. Normally, I'd grab breakfast and scroll social media for a while, but that morning, I found myself hunched over my phone, searching every corner of the internet for some logical explanation. Deer collisions, weird reflection issues, illusions caused by rain. They all popped up, yet none matched what I'd experienced. Some people online talked about cryptids, discussing wendigos or shapeshifters. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I believed in any of that. Still, the descriptions, creatures that didn't reflect light properly, animals that stood unnaturally tall, left me more uneasy. It felt like one of those rabbit holes you fall down when you're desperate for answers, but every new sentence I read made the memory worse. Rather than comfort, I got a deeper sense that the roads I'd always considered home turf might be hiding something I couldn't begin to understand. By the time I shut off my phone, the sun was well above the rooftops, and I realized I was going to be late for work if I didn't hurry. I forced myself into a quick shower, hoping hot water would jolt me awake enough to function. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was more pallid than usual, eyes ringed with exhaustion. I couldn't bring myself to dwell on it too long because I knew if I stared too hard, I might talk myself into calling out sick. Stepping outside, I noticed how normal everything seemed. The sky was a bright blue, last night's puddles evaporating in small wisps off the asphalt. Neighbors were driving off on daily routines, no one looking even remotely disturbed. Part of me wished I could blend into that normalcy, just push last night into some forgotten corner of my mind. It was tough to do that though, when every time I blinked, I imagined that warped creature was waiting behind my eyelids. I hopped into my car, feeling my chest tighten when I reached for the ignition. The memory of gripping the steering wheel in the dark, bracing for a collision that never happened, came rushing back. But it was broad daylight now, so it had to be safer, right? I tried to convince myself of that as I pulled out of the driveway. Work was only 10 minutes away, a drive filled with school zones and traffic lights. No lonely highways where horrifying shapes might materialize. As I cruised through town, I caught myself glancing at every patch of grass along the sidewalk, almost expecting to see a deer-like silhouette behind every tree. Nothing out of the ordinary showed up, yet my nerves remained on alert. When I finally arrived at work, I breathed a small sigh of relief. Being around coworkers and busy tasks offered a distraction. I was able to shove those thoughts aside for a handful of hours, losing myself in the mundane swirl of emails and phone calls. But every so often, while staring at my computer screen, I'd remember the flickering edges of that shadow. It would replay in my mind, an uninvited loop. After clocking out, I knew I couldn't hide indoors forever. Groceries were running low, and I needed gas, so I decided to swing by a store on the outskirts of town. The drive there felt normal enough. Bright sun, mild traffic, folks moving along. But as soon as I left the more congested roads and turned onto a quieter stretch that skirted a patch of woods, my heartbeat started hammering. The trees weren't thick enough to truly block out the sun, but the overhang of branches dappled the road in shadows. I noticed how they seemed to shift with each gust of wind, and it was impossible not to recall that ephemeral silhouette from last night. Just as I crested a small hill, a deer stepped out from the brush. This was definitely a real one, normal height, regular fur, ordinary antlers. Yet something about its posture made me slow down. It locked eyes with me through the windshield. For a split second, I swore it recognized me. Rationally, I knew that was absurd. How would a deer recognize me specifically? But its stare was unwavering, and I felt pinned there, as if an invisible string tugged between us. My hand shook on the wheel, and I barely remembered to tap the brakes as it casually ambled across the pavement. Once it reached the other side, it paused, head slightly turned, still watching. Without making a sound, I pressed the gas, rolling forward at a crawl, not daring to take my eyes off it until it was out of sight. Nothing about that brief exchange should have been remarkable, but it left me rattled. Eventually, I finished shopping and headed home, groceries rattling in the back seat. I tried to laugh it off, getting spooked by a typical deer in broad daylight. It still made my chest tighten though, because I felt a certain awareness in that encounter, like it was reminding me of the shapes I'd seen just hours before. When I finally got back, I felt strangely drained, like I'd run a marathon even though I'd only run errands. That evening, I settled onto the couch with my phone, determined to find something, anything, that would help me handle this situation. My boyfriend texted me, asking how I was holding up, and I spilled my thoughts in a long, rambling reply. He brought up the idea of a dash cam, and I quickly realized he was right. If there was something strange out there, maybe I could capture it. That possibility sent a shiver of dread through my whole body. Did I really want proof that these shadows existed? But ignoring them didn't feel like an option anymore. I ended up reading through product reviews and ordering one that promised high-quality night footage. The second I hit the confirm button, it felt like I'd crossed a line. I was inviting a confrontation with the unknown. After that, I walked around my living room, clicking off lamps, flipping them back on, anything to keep myself occupied. It was just about sunset, and I noticed how the clouds were shifting into thick masses of gray. Another storm was brewing. I glanced out the window, staring down the darkening street. Houses glowed with porch lights, and cars passed lazily. But the storm clouds made me think of last night's downpour. In the pit of my stomach, I sensed that something waited for nightfall. My phone buzzed with a text, my friend wanting me to hang out, but the thought of driving after sundown made me hesitate. Eventually, I replied that I wasn't feeling up to it. I tried to ignore the wave of anxiety that simple decision caused, but I knew I was changing my routine out of fear. Before bed, I kept checking the shipping status of my dashcam like it was some lifeline. I stared at the clock, measuring each passing minute against the deepening gloom outside. Rain started tapping at the windows again, not nearly as fierce as last time, but enough that it brought back flashes of how it felt to be caught in that downpour on the highway. My stomach twisted in knots, and I gripped the edge of the table, half expecting to see a tall silhouette cross the yard, or another smaller creature zip by the corner of my vision. Nothing moved, except for the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. By the time midnight rolled around, I was wide awake, senses so sharp that the ticking clock in the kitchen sounded like a drumbeat. The forecast promised heavier rain later in the week. The idea of driving in those conditions again made my heart pound. I wished I could just bury myself under blankets and never leave the house until I had that dash cam rolling, but life would go on, and I couldn't avoid the roads forever. From my window, I watched as the sky finally split open in a drizzle. Droplets bounced off the pavement, reflecting the streetlight's dull glow. Somewhere beyond that thin curtain of water, I felt a presence. Was it just paranoia? A leftover fear from a single terrifying drive? I didn't have an answer. What I did know was that everything in my life seemed different now. Like I'd stepped into a reality where the rules had shifted slightly off-center. Tomorrow, I'd have to face another day, possibly another drive, and sooner or later I'd be out there at night again. As the rain fell, I wondered if those silhouettes were out in the darkness, waiting for the next chance to appear, and I couldn't decide which possibility scared me more, the idea that it was all in my head, or that every bit of it was real. Living on the edge of a forest teaches you a thing or two about silence. I'd grown used to it, or so I thought. The cabin my brother and I shared wasn't much, but it was ours, tucked into a clearing surrounded by tall trees. Quiet was normal, peaceful even. Until that night. I'd decided to walk the trail later than usual. The heat of the day had been unbearable, and the cool night air seemed like an invitation I couldn't refuse. Luna, my shepherd mix, trotted at my heels, her tail wagging in anticipation. She loved these walks as much as I did. I grabbed my flashlight, double-checked the batteries, and stepped off the porch into the dark. The first half of the loop was always my favorite. It skirted the meadow, with just enough moonlight to guide my way. Tonight, the grass shimmered silver under the half-moon, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. I could see the faint outline of our cabin from the corner of my eye, a comforting anchor as I walked. Luna sniffed at the trail, darting ahead, her nails clicking against the hard-packed dirt. When we reached the forest edge, I paused, staring into the dark wall of trees. The second half of the loop cut deep into the woods, where the canopy blocked the moonlight, and the air grew thick with the smell of woods and decay. The flashlight beam was thin, swallowed by the shadows almost as soon as it touched them. Still, I'd done this walk dozens of times before. There was no reason to feel uneasy, or so I told myself. The woods were quieter than usual. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just the crunch of my boots and the soft panting of Luna somewhere ahead. I adjusted my flashlight, swinging it left and right. But the shadows seemed thicker tonight, as if they were closing in. I told myself it was just my imagination, shook it off, and pressed forward. I was nearly at the bend that marked the halfway point when I heard it. "Can you hear me? I need help." I froze. The voice was faint but clear, cutting through the stillness like a blade. It wasn't frantic or scared. If anything, it sounded flat, practiced, like someone reading lines off a script. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but all it caught were trees. "Can you hear me? I need help." The same words, the same tone, no variation, no urgency. I clicked off the flashlight, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The dark closed around me like a fist, and my heart thudded hard enough to hurt. I crouched low, gripping Luna's collar to keep her from barking, but she wasn't barking. She was growling, a deep guttural sound I'd never heard from her before. "Luna," I whispered, trying to pull her back. She didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the trees, her teeth bared, the growl rumbling in her chest like distant thunder. I followed her gaze, but the shadows gave nothing away. The voice came again, closer now. "Can you hear me? I need help." I felt a spike of panic shoot through me. My first thought was someone was hurt, lost in the woods. But there was something wrong, something about the way the voice didn't carry like it should have. It was too even, too measured, as if whoever was speaking wasn't really speaking at all. Luna broke away from my grip and bolted toward the sound. "No!" I hissed, scrambling after her, my flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught her for a split second, a blur of black and tan fur disappearing into the underbrush. The voice called again, louder this time, the monotone cutting through my panic like a razor. "Luna!" I called, my voice shaking. The forest answered with silence, then it laughed. Low and guttural, the sound rippled through the trees. My skin prickled and my knees locked. It wasn't a human laugh. It couldn't be. It was too deep, too wrong, like the growl of an animal that had learned how to mimic us. I turned and ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs as I crashed through the underbrush, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly ahead of me. The laugh followed, rising and falling, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. Images filled my mind. Something crouching in the dark, grinning wide enough to split its face, watching me run. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing, I didn't stop. The cabin was in sight, the porch light glowing faintly through the dark. I stumbled up the steps and slammed the door behind me, my chest heaving, my ears straining for any sound beyond the walls. Luna was on the porch, waiting, her fur bristling. She stared at the woods, growling low and steady, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. That night, the forest was silent. Too silent. And I knew, deep down, that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the sound of something watching, something waiting. By the time I slammed the cabin door behind me, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. Luna followed me in, her tail tucked and her eyes still fixed on the woods outside. She growled low in her throat, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Whatever was out there, she'd seen it. I hadn't, and maybe that was worse. What the hell is going on? My brother Nate came stomping out of his room, barefoot and holding a wrench he must have grabbed in a hurry. He froze when he saw me, out of breath and wild-eyed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I don't know what it was," I said, gasping for air. I couldn't bring myself to explain right away, not with my chest still tight and my ears ringing from the run. "Something in the woods. I heard someone. And Luna, she just ran off." Nate's expression hardened. He wasn't the type to scare easy, and I could tell he thought I was overreacting. Still, he pulled the curtain shut and turned the lock on the door. "Calm down," he said. "Start from the beginning." I tried to. I told him about the voice, the way it sounded too wrong, about the laughter that didn't belong to anything human. Nate listened, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When I finished, he shook his head. "You sure it wasn't a coyote? They can make some freaky noises," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and I could see him glancing at the window just like I had. "I know what coyotes sound like, Nate," I snapped, still shaking. "This wasn't an animal. This was something else." Before he could argue, there was a noise outside, a soft, deliberate tapping on the window by the front door. Luna stiffened and let out a deep, throaty growl. Her body coiled like a spring. Nate froze, and we both stared at the window. The curtains were drawn tight, but the tapping continued, steady and unhurried. "What the hell?" Nate muttered under his breath. He grabbed the shotgun from its rack by the door and held it at the ready. The tapping stopped. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. Instead, the silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural, like the air before a storm. I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple. Luna broke the quiet with a sharp bark, her attention snapping toward the back wall. That's when the scratching started. It came from the other side of the cabin, long, deliberate drags against the wood, as if someone were running a claw or a knife along the exterior. Nate's face darkened. He raised the shotgun and gestured for me to stay behind him. Slowly, we moved toward the back door, Luna close on our heels. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Nate yanked open the door and stepped out onto the back porch, the shotgun raised. I followed, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the yard and the forest beyond. Nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the moonlight casting jagged shadows on the ground. "See anything?" I whispered. "No," Nate said, his voice tight. He lowered the shotgun and scanned the tree line. "Whatever it was, it's gone." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, some cruel trick of the night. But then I saw them, 3 long, parallel gouges carved into the wooden post by the porch steps. They were fresh, the splinters still pale and raw against the aged wood. "Nate," I said, pointing. He followed my gaze and his jaw clenched. "We're going inside," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The rest of the night was a blur of restless waiting. We sat in the living room with the shotgun propped against Nate's knee. Luna curled at my feet, her ears twitching at every sound. I thought the worst of it was over. I thought whatever it was had moved on. But when dawn broke, the world outside felt wrong. The air was too still, the forest too quiet. There was no chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves. Just an oppressive, watchful silence. Nate insisted we go check the trail, though every instinct in my body screamed to stay away. Armed with the shotgun and a crowbar, we retraced my path from the night before. The further we went, the heavier the air seemed to get, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. We found the spot where I'd first heard the voice. The underbrush was trampled, and there were scratches on the trees. Deep, jagged marks that couldn't have been made by any animal I knew of. Then we found something worse. Near the bend in the trail was a patch of ground where the vegetation had withered and died, leaving behind a blackened, brittle circle. In the middle of it was a small totem, a crude bundle of sticks bound together with a strip of leather with a piece of bone tied to the top. The sight of it sent a shiver down my back. It didn't belong there. Nothing about it did. "Some sick joke," Nate muttered, bending down to pick it up. "Don't touch it," I said, my voice sharp. But he didn't listen. He snapped it in half and tossed the pieces into the bushes. "Let's go," he said, turning back toward the cabin. "Whatever's out here, we're not giving it the satisfaction." I didn't argue, but as we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a mistake. The woods seemed darker now, the shadows longer, as if they were creeping closer. I didn't say anything to Nate, but I knew he felt it too. I could see it in the way he tightened his grip on the shotgun, his eyes darting toward the trees. That night the scratching came back. Louder this time. More insistent. And I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was already on edge. The whole day had been wrong. The silence, the shadows creeping across the yard, the feeling that every time I turned around, something would be there, watching. Nate hadn't said much since we got back from the trail. He didn't need to. The tension in his shoulders said it all. We locked every door and window in the cabin, even though deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there didn't care about locks. Luna stayed glued to my side, pacing restlessly, her ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. She'd growl softly every now and then, her gaze fixed on the windows. Nate sat at the table, the shotgun loaded and ready. He hadn't touched his dinner, and neither had I. The cabin felt smaller than usual, like the walls were closing in. Then the first tap came. It was soft, almost polite, like someone knocking on the front door. We froze. Luna let out a low growl, her hackles raised. Nate stood slowly, shotgun in hand, and gestured for me to stay put. I didn't argue. The tap came again, louder this time, as if whoever or whatever was outside was testing our nerves. Nate moved to the door and peeked through the curtain. His shoulders stiffened. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. He stepped back from the door, his face pale. "There's nothing there," he said finally, but his voice was tight. Too tight. The tapping stopped. For a moment the silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. Then the scratching began. It came from the side of the cabin, long, deliberate strokes against the wood, like claws dragging across the walls. Luna barked sharply, the sound slicing through the tension like a knife. Nate swore under his breath and motioned for me to follow him to the back door. "I'm not waiting for this thing to come inside," he muttered. "We're leaving." "What if it's waiting out there?" I asked, my voice shaking. I hated how scared I sounded, but I couldn't help it. My gut told me we weren't safe anywhere. Not in the cabin, not in the yard, not in the truck. Nate didn't answer. He opened the back door a crack and looked out. The scratching stopped. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then a low, guttural laugh rippled through the air. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Get to the truck," Nate said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Now. We made it as far as the porch steps before we saw the trees. The forest had moved. I know how that sounds, but there's no other way to describe it. The tree line, which had always been a good 30 feet from the edge of the yard, was now just a few paces away. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches swaying without a breeze. I could feel them watching us, even though I knew that was impossible. "Get in the truck," Nate repeated, shoving me forward. He climbed in behind me, slamming the door shut, and jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. He tried again. Nothing. "Come on," he growled, hitting the steering wheel. The laugh came again, louder this time, echoing around us. It felt like it was inside the truck, curling into every corner. I looked out the window and froze. Shadows moved between the trees. Tall, spindly shapes that didn't walk so much as glide. Their eyes caught the moonlight, glowing faintly, like embers in the dark. One of them stepped closer, and I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something else. Something wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, and its grin was too wide. "Get out of the truck," Nate said suddenly, his voice sharp. "We'll make a run for it." "Run where?" I asked, my voice rising. "It's everywhere." Before he could respond, Luna started barking wildly. She clawed at the truck door, desperate to get out. I grabbed her collar, but she pulled free and bolted into the yard. "Luna!" I screamed, fumbling with the door handle. Nate grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said. "It's what it wants." But I couldn't just leave her. I yanked the door open and ran after her, the cold air biting at my face. Luna stopped at the edge of the yard, barking at the trees. I grabbed her collar and turned to run back, but the truck was gone. No, not gone. Hidden. The forest had swallowed it, the trees twisting and crowding together like a wall. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw Nate standing where the porch had been. Only now, the cabin wasn't there. It was just him. The shotgun clutched in his hands, surrounded by trees. The laugh came again, louder and closer. The shadows moved, circling us, their eyes glowing brighter. Nate raised the shotgun, aiming into the dark. "Stay behind me," he said. Before I could argue, one of the shadows lunged. The blast of the shotgun lit up the night for a split second, and I saw it clearly. Its hollow eyes, its impossibly wide grin, its two long arms reaching for us. And then, it was gone. The woods were silent again. Nate grabbed my arm, dragging me back toward what used to be the yard, the totem. I remembered the totem he'd snapped in half earlier. My gut told me it wasn't just some weird decoration. It was a warning, or maybe a seal. "We have to burn it," I said. "What?" "The totem," I shouted. "We have to burn the pieces." Nate didn't argue. We scrambled back to the spot where he'd tossed the broken pieces and piled them together. He handed me his lighter, and my hands shook as I flicked it to life. The flames caught quickly, climbing higher than they should have, casting strange shadows on the trees. The laugh faded, the glowing eyes disappeared, and the forest, slowly, began to retreat. We stood there in silence, watching as the fire burned itself out. I wanted to believe it was over, but I could feel it. Something still out there, just beyond the trees. Whatever we'd done, whatever we'd disturbed, it wasn't finished with us. Not yet. Be careful when going into the woods. You never know what you will encounter. I've been drawn to the Appalachian region for as long as I can remember. Something about those towering slopes and shadowy hollows always felt like a gateway into a different world. Beautiful, yet laced with an unsettling aura that's tough to articulate. A few friends and I decided to head out to Holly River State Park in West Virginia, lured by rumors of an old family cemetery hidden up on a ridge. We had only a vague idea of where it might be. All we knew was that we needed to follow a winding trail that cut through dense undergrowth before climbing up toward this rumored graveyard. So the three of us piled into my car early that morning, excited by the prospect of a day hike. The drive itself was so quiet that we began making offhand jokes, like something was waiting out there, just beyond view. Maybe it was nerves talking, or maybe I'd had too much coffee. Either way, my stomach churned in that weird way it does when you're both excited and half spooked. When we arrived, the parking lot near the main trailhead had a few vehicles, but we didn't cross paths with any actual people. The entire place seemed deserted. We shrugged, figuring everyone must have already started their morning treks. After all, Holly River is a decently sized park. Folks could be scattered across countless trails. I tried to keep my mind on the gorgeous landscape, moss-covered stones, towering hardwoods, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Yet there was this hush underneath it all, like nature had dialed itself down a notch. We kicked off our hike around midday. The sky was overcast, so the light filtering through the branches came in muted silvery patches. The trail was pretty well worn at first, so we made quick progress. The chatter between us died off once we noticed how oddly calm the forest felt. Everything about the place demanded our attention, from the tangled roots underfoot to the looming canopy overhead. Occasionally we'd catch snatches of movement in our peripheral vision, maybe squirrels, but the scuttling always stopped the moment we tried to look closer. My friend commented that it seemed like the place was sizing us up, and nobody argued. We pressed on, climbing steadily. Eventually, we left the official trail in search of that old graveyard. The path we followed was more of a half-remembered rumor than a marked route. A fallen tree forced us to detour through thick brush, and my arms got scratched up enough that I started wishing we'd picked an easier day hike. Still, I couldn't help feeling compelled to keep going. There was a raw, ancient feel to the land that I couldn't let go of. A couple hours in, the terrain turned steep. Loose stones threatened to send us sliding if we weren't careful, and we had to cling to exposed roots for stability. We nearly missed the cemetery altogether, spotting it only because of a warped iron gate that caught the corner of my friend's eye. A row of leaning tombstones stood beyond, the lettering on them faded and chipped. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they'd been here for centuries. Up close, the graveyard gave off an atmosphere that bordered on oppressive. The headstones bore names we could barely read, and the ground was covered in tangled weeds. The three of us wandered, taking pictures and gingerly brushing aside overgrown vines. Every so often, a subtle breeze would move past us, bringing with it a musty odor that reminded me of damp soil and decaying leaves. My pulse was hammering in my ears for reasons I couldn't explain, but I tried to play it cool. We stayed longer than we intended, mostly because we were fascinated, and maybe a little horrified, by the idea that entire families could be buried out here, forgotten by time. Each time the wind picked up, we paused, half expecting something or someone to step out from behind those looming trees. It was all in my head, I told myself, probably just a side effect of being in a graveyard at sunset. By the time we left, the sun had started sliding down the sky, painting the ridge in murky oranges and purples. We hadn't planned on night hiking, but it was creeping up on us fast. The idea of navigating a dark forest trail made our nerves spike, so we decided the park's main road would be safer, even if it was a bit out of the way. We figured it couldn't be more than a few miles to loop around and reach the campground parking lot. Leaving that cemetery felt like stepping away from a forgotten realm. Once we hit a semblance of a trail again, a fragile sense of relief settled over us. But it was short-lived. The path to the road was riddled with roots, slippery patches, and random branches that snagged at our clothes. Little cracks and snaps echoed in the brush, just enough to keep us on edge. We hurried along, willing ourselves not to think about the dark shapes dancing in our peripherals. Finally, we broke free of the tree line and spotted the asphalt up ahead. The sense of relief was almost overwhelming, like stumbling onto a lifeline in the middle of nowhere. But an uneasy vibe still trailed behind us, no matter how hard we tried to shake it. The light was fading fast, and the road itself looked empty in both directions. No cars, no people, nothing. Just a hush that felt downright eerie. That's where the first leg of our journey ended, with us stepping onto that road and peering into the early twilight. Looking back, I realized we had no clue how unsettling the next stretch would be. In the moment, though, we were just grateful to be out of the thick woods. Little did we know, that relief was about to dissolve quicker than we could have imagined. After stumbling out of the tree line, we reached this narrow asphalt road that was supposed to lead us back to the campground. And for a few fleeting moments, we were relieved. No more tripping over roots or scraping our arms on undergrowth. The wind seemed calmer too, though I swear the air felt heavier than it had in the woods. With dusk rolling in, we figured we had maybe 3 miles to cover, tops. But it was eerily quiet. I mean, you'd expect at least a car or two to pass by in a park this size, even late in the day. Instead, we had this winding stretch of road all to ourselves. I remember my friend joking, "We're basically the only people left on Earth." And none of us cracked a real smile. We picked a direction, based on a ragged sign pointing toward the campground, and started walking, the sun melting into the horizon behind us. As we hiked along, the darkness deepened. The trees on either side of us stood like silent onlookers. Every so often, something would stir in the brush, maybe a small critter or a bird, but we never saw anything. That emptiness felt unnatural, like the park itself was waiting for something to happen. We'd covered about half the distance when we spotted the silhouettes. Up ahead, illuminated by the faint remnants of twilight, were at least 5 figures. They were just standing there in the middle of the road, as if they were waiting for us. Relief surged through me for a second, thankful that we weren't the only ones out there. My friend even waved, though none of them waved back. We moved closer, calling out a timid, "Hey" or two, hoping for some response. Nothing. They were close enough now that I should have been able to make out features, faces, hair color, clothing details. But it was like I could only see the general shape of them, as if the light was playing tricks. The weirdest part was that they didn't make a sound. No conversation, no footsteps shuffling on asphalt. They were just there, like placeholders. Then, without warning, they started to fade. One by one, they flickered in and out until all that remained was a vacant stretch of road. The 3 of us were rooted in place, trying to process what was happening. We weren't imagining this. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe our eyes were messing with us after the dim forest. Or maybe they just slipped away into the dark. But as we reached the exact spot where we'd seen them, it was clear there was nowhere to go. On one side, a sheer drop fell away into a valley. The other side was a jagged slope of rock that would have been nearly impossible to climb quietly, even in broad daylight. The asphalt itself looked undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of scuffling, not even a stray candy wrapper. Just empty road stretching off into the shadows. A cold sense of dread settled over us. We hung around for a minute, shining phone flashlights and calling out, but nobody answered. The idea of those figures just evaporating forced our tension up several notches. I couldn't tell if we'd witnessed something supernatural, or if my eyes were conspiring against me in the low light. Either way, it triggered a kind of primal fear I haven't felt too often in my life. We finally decided to press on, hearts thumping from the sudden shift in atmosphere. Every step from then on felt like it echoed a little too loudly. We kept glancing back, convinced we'd see the group again, trailing behind us, or maybe popping up ahead. But there was nothing. At one point, I caught a whiff of a faint odor, sort of earthy and decayed, but it was gone as soon as I noticed it. By then, we were moving faster than I'd ever hiked in my life. The final stretch to the campground felt like a fever dream, each of us expecting something horrible to lurch out of the darkness. When we finally caught sight of the campground sign, it was like stepping into another world. Only there weren't any people there either. The entire place was disturbingly quiet save for the distant rustle of trees. Usually a state park campground has some buzz, campfires crackling, murmured conversations, maybe a dog barking. We got nothing. Our car was right where we left it, sitting in a patch of moonlit gravel. I can't describe how relieved I was to see it. We clambered inside, locking the doors more out of instinct than necessity. Who locks up in a lonely campground? But something about that night made every protective move feel justified. My friend gunned the ignition, and we peeled out, headlights pushing back the darkness a little. That entire drive out of the park, I kept expecting those figures to emerge from the trees or appear in the rearview mirror. Only once we hit the main highway did we dare speak about it in more than whispers. We tossed around ideas. Mass hallucination, illusions caused by the fading light, or maybe some group of locals messing with us. Still, none of those explanations explained the silent disappearance act. Days later, every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those silhouettes flicker and vanish like they'd never existed at all. I've heard plenty of stories about weird sightings in the Appalachians, ghostly hikers, phantom lantern lights bobbing through the trees. But until that night, I brushed them off as campfire tales. Now, I'm not so sure. All I know is that something happened on that silent road, and I can't shake the idea that it was a glimpse into the unknown. That's the story of how a simple day trip to Holly River spiraled into a haunting mystery that continues to gnaw at me. Was it some lost echo of the park's past, or did we stumble into something far stranger than we were prepared to handle? Honestly, I still don't have an answer. But there's one thing I can say for sure. The image of those 5 figures dissolving in the twilight is going to stay with me. I guess not every twist in these old mountains needs a tidy explanation. Sometimes it's enough to know that the darkness holds more secrets than we can ever hope to understand. I'd planned on taking it easy that evening, maybe practice a few fishing knots, or help Grandpa Morley tidy up the workshop. Instead, a couple of friends, Ray and Kelsey, coaxed me into one last round of our favorite hide-and-seek style game. It was something we'd concocted years ago, chasing each other through every nook and cranny of the Appalachians behind Grandpa's homestead. Funny how you can grow up around these hills and still feel like you've barely scratched the surface of what's out there. The house sits at the base of a ridge that rises into dense hardwood forests. Grandpa always said the land has its own memory, that every gust of wind and snap of twigs might be a signal if you listen closely enough. I laughed it off whenever he got too mystical, but tonight, I was starting to see where he might have been coming from. The 3 of us were in the yard, the western sky burning orange where the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. Kelsey decided she'd be it this time, so Ray and I scampered toward the slope. We both had camouflage jackets, more fashion statement than functional gear, but I like to think it helped us blend in. The plan was to outsmart Kelsey by moving uphill. She'd never guess we'd take the steeper path. Or so we thought. We crested that slope, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet the forest had become. Usually this time of evening, you can hear crickets winding up for their nighttime chorus, maybe an owl calling in the distance. That night, it felt like everything paused, waiting. Ray and I tucked ourselves into a shallow dip in the ground, just behind a line of scraggly bushes. We had a clear view of the yard, though it was getting dim. Kelsey's flashlight beam danced across the grass below, and we congratulated ourselves on the perfect hiding spot. All we had to do was lie low until she gave up. Easy enough. A moment later, a low, rhythmic pulse reached us, like a drumbeat echoing from far off. Ray's head jerked up. I glanced at him, wondering if he felt it too, that buzzing in the pit of my stomach. Drums in this part of the mountains? Maybe a local gathering, though it made 0 sense for it to suddenly start after dusk. The sound grew. The beat became something more than a lone drum, chanting or singing, weaving in. And accompanying everything, a melody that shouldn't fit any of it. A high, keening note, reminiscent of bagpipes. That unexpected note stirred something protective in me, like I needed to stand up and figure out who was out there. Except, stepping forward was the last thing I wanted to do. The music peaked, reverberating through the trees, each note rippling across the slope. Ray and we just stared at each other, neither wanting to speak out loud. Even whispering felt too risky, as if we'd draw unwanted attention. My lungs begged for a deep breath, but I tried not to make a sound. Then it died away, gone in half a heartbeat. The sudden lack of noise rang in my ears more than the drumbeat did. I couldn't bear another second of stillness. Ray must have felt the same because he jerked his head downhill, eyes wide. We both sprang up, stumbling over that ridge. Gravity did half the work, sending us skidding down faster than we intended. A root snagged Ray's foot, nearly toppling him. I grabbed his sleeve, and we both regained balance long enough to lurch down into the yard. Kelsey didn't need an explanation. She stood frozen near the house's floodlight, face pale with confusion. Grandpa stepped onto the porch, an old lantern in one hand, eyebrows knit. We didn't offer much beyond a frantic, "We heard something weird." Even saying that felt like an understatement. Inside the house, we slammed the door behind us, hearts hammering. Grandpa told us to sit, voice firm but calm, and started asking questions. Ray tried to describe the chanting and the bagpipes, while I stared out the window, half expecting more noise to erupt from the hills. But everything beyond the floodlit yard was black, mute. Eventually, Grandpa checked his radio to see if there were any announcements. Some festival, a big group camping, a local event that might explain away the noise. Nothing came through. He frowned, as if something he'd worried about was stepping into reality. He suggested we all stick close, even though part of me wanted to bolt for my truck and drive into the nearest town. We ended up huddling in the living room, not saying much. Each time the house creaked with night settling in, we jerked our heads toward the windows. Part of me thought I was overreacting. The other part said I couldn't be too careful. At one point, Kelsey started describing how it sounded almost ceremonial. Ray kept mentioning the bagpipes, how out of place they felt in these mountains. Grandpa just listened in silence, like he was adding up bits of a puzzle we couldn't see. And so we waited for dawn, adrenaline coursing so hard that sleep didn't stand a chance. Whatever we heard out there, it didn't feel like an accidental jam session. It had the determined rhythm of something bigger, something we weren't meant to stumble upon. I glanced through the window one more time, across that slope where the silhouette of bare branches seemed to watch us back. The night had only just begun, and I was afraid it wasn't done revealing whatever secrets lay in those woods. Morning light had a way of making the previous night feel like a fever dream. But when I opened my eyes, the knot in my gut told me it wasn't just an overactive imagination. Ray was already awake, pacing in front of the fireplace. Kelsey sipped coffee at the window, staring off at the slope where we'd heard that eerie music. The house felt tense, like we were all braced for whatever might come next. Grandpa Morley was digging through his old field notebooks, scattering them across the kitchen table. He murmured to himself as he flipped pages, sometimes tapping a map he'd pinned down with an empty coffee cup. Finally, he called us over. "This area right here," he pointed at a forested patch just beyond the ridge. "I've heard stories about folks finding strange footprints, hearing unexplainable sounds. Never had solid proof, but no shortage of rumors." Ray wanted answers. He kept talking about how that chanting still echoed in his ears. Kelsey looked as though she wanted to crawl under a blanket and forget everything. But Grandpa said if we wanted peace of mind, we had to see what was out there in the daylight. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but curiosity gnawed at me. The only way to settle my nerves was to confront whatever was lurking in those trees. We followed the same path as the night before, only this time, sunbeams cut through the canopy. The forest felt awake now, birds calling overhead, the smell of wet leaves underfoot. My boots squelched in the soft soil. About 20 minutes in, we spotted footprints in the mud near an old game trail. More than one set, too. Some were big enough that I wondered if a whole group had come through. Kelsey knelt down, tracing the edges with her fingertips. She didn't say a word, but her expression told me she was unsettled. As we pressed deeper, a low clearing opened up. In the center were stones stacked in a wide circle. The ground was littered with scorched branches, as if a fire had burned there recently. I kicked at a pile of ash, uncovering what might have been animal bones. Nearby, Ray found shredded fabric snagged on a sharp branch, checkered like tartan. The breath caught in my throat. Bagpipes, a Scottish pattern, and those drum rhythms. None of it added up, but it sure felt connected. Before we could piece things together, that same beat thrummed in the distance. All three of us froze, and every nerve I had went on high alert. The chanting returned, and with it came a deeper, resonating drumbeat that rattled through the trees. We ducked behind an uprooted trunk, peering over as shadows flickered beyond the bushes. I saw multiple figures moving, at least 5 or 6, too many to count accurately. One carried what looked like a bagpipe under an arm. Another brandished a tall staff decorated with dangling bits of cloth or feathers. It felt like we'd trespassed on a hidden ceremony. My pulse roared in my head, urging me to get moving. Ray tugged my jacket, and we bolted. Adrenaline drove us as we crashed through the undergrowth. The chanting didn't fade right away. In fact, for a moment it seemed to chase us, echoing in all directions. We burst out onto the slope behind the homestead, nearly stumbling over each other. Grandpa was there, a rifle propped against his hip. He took one look at our faces and told us to get inside. Over the next hour, we told him about the footprints, the circle of stones, the scrap of tartan, and the silhouettes with bagpipes in hand. He listened, and at the end, he nodded like it confirmed a rumor he'd once heard. That generations ago, certain families who settled these hills mixed cultures, Scottish and Native American, keeping old traditions alive in the most secluded spots. There was no telling if they meant harm. Grandpa planned to notify a ranger station, see if they'd heard of any suspicious gatherings. But I think we all sensed the same foreboding truth. Whatever goes on in these woods after dark might not welcome outsiders. We'd seen enough to know we didn't belong out there at night. When dusk rolled around, we stayed close to the house, porch lights blazing. Kelsey kept her eyes on the ridge, looking for any flicker of firelight or movement among the trees. Ray sat with me in the living room, occasionally glancing at the window. Every so often, I half expected those drums to sound again. Even if they stayed silent, I knew they were only a heartbeat away, tucked in the deep pockets of the Appalachians. We had a name for the fear now, but it didn't make it any less real, and it didn't keep me from wondering if next time we might not get away so easily. I'm writing this because every time I look back on my experiences out there, I end up pacing around my apartment, uneasy and restless. People love talking about the Appalachian Trail as if it's just scenic overlooks and friendly hikers, but I learned there's a lot more than meets the eye. Before I ever set foot on that route, I was the type of person who devoured paranormal stories. Something about the unknown always grabbed my attention. Maybe it's just human nature to chase mysteries. By the time I started planning my extended trek, I'd convinced myself that I was more prepared than most for whatever I'd find in those ancient mountains. The reality? Completely different. I remember my first stretch near Blood Mountain. History loomed around every bend, not just from the Civil War sites, but from the remnants of tribal conflicts that went on long before European settlers showed up. The ground felt worn in a way that's tough to put into words, like it had absorbed centuries of voices. A couple of nights in, I decided to camp alone in a spot where the trees formed a thick canopy, letting in only patches of moonlight. The moment I unrolled my sleeping gear, I noticed that the usual night chorus, crickets, distant owls, had faded. There was an odd sensation of being watched from multiple angles. My mind started to wander, and I ended up lying awake far longer than I wanted. The strange part is, I was positive I spotted movements where there shouldn't have been any, silhouettes flitting at the periphery of my headlamp's glow. Once or twice, I had the distinct impression of a figure standing behind a distant trunk, dressed in something that didn't fit modern times. I never got a clear look, but that sense of stepping across some invisible threshold kept me wired until sunrise. A few weeks later, I ventured closer to Harper's Ferry, where you can literally walk among the traces of the Civil War trenches. One late afternoon, as the light shifted from gold to a dull gray, I saw a person in old-style military gear drifting along a sunken path. My brain tried to rationalize. Maybe it's a reenactor, maybe I was exhausted. But the person, or whatever it was, vanished almost instantly. The spot fell silent, like everything around had decided to pause. For a second I questioned if I was alone in that corridor of battered earth. It left me on edge for the next several days, scanning every ridgeline in case something else appeared. But nothing compares to the night a bear and I had our awkward confrontation. I'd rigged up a hammock between two sturdy trunks and dozed off, lulled by the distant rustling. At some unknown hour, a firm prod against my back startled me awake. I reacted without thinking, twisting around and striking with my hand. I connected with fur and realized in horror it was a bear's muzzle. Adrenaline shot through me as I waited for it to decide if I was more trouble than I was worth. Instead, it crashed off through the brush, leaving me stunned and trying to slow my breathing. The rest of that evening, every single noise made me tense up, braced for a second round that, thankfully, never came. Funny thing is, when I mention this to people, they usually fixate on the bear encounter. They don't realize that animals, wild as they might be, don't compare to the unsettling presence that seems embedded in parts of this trail. That feeling of history refusing to let go. Those fleeting glimpses of things wearing outdated clothes. The heavy atmosphere around certain places. It's all there, woven into the land. I'd tell myself these experiences were just the product of fatigue. Maybe I'd just been reading too many ghost stories. Yet something nagged at me, like I'd stumbled onto a realm where the past occasionally slips through the cracks. Later, in Pennsylvania, I'd discover what true dread can feel like. That, however, is a story for another post, one that still keeps me alert at odd hours, replaying every step I took through that long dark night. I thought I'd seen the worst of the trail. Run-ins with spooky silhouettes and a half-asleep confrontation with a bear had me convinced I was prepared for anything. Turns out, Pennsylvania wanted to prove me wrong. After crossing the state line, I remember feeling oddly optimistic. The weather was pleasant enough, and I decided to sleep under the stars rather than set up any shelter. The sky was so clear earlier that evening, and I wanted to experience the open air for once. I laid out my sleeping pad and got comfy in my bag, surrounded by trees and that faint hum of nighttime insects. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime past midnight, I woke up with my heart thumping. The night had gone dead silent, which rattled me. Normally you'd at least hear a hooting owl or wind rustling the branches. Instead, a thin, eerie whine reverberated all around. It was so soft, like it was trying not to exist. But it also seemed inescapable. Every instinct told me I shouldn't remain there. My breathing felt tight, and the air felt heavier than usual, as if some invisible presence had crept in and settled on top of me. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that it might just be the wind through the leaves or some small animal. Yet the whine didn't change pitch, didn't shift direction, didn't do anything I'd label as normal. The dread in the pit of my stomach wasn't something I could shrug off. Within minutes, I was shoving gear back into my pack, fumbling for my headlamp. It took every ounce of willpower not to panic and run blindly through the dark. The moment I found the trail markers and started moving, the heaviness slowly eased. After maybe half a mile, the sensation broke, like stepping out of a dense fog. The noise faded into nothingness, and I stood there, leaning on a tree, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to turn back, search for some logical explanation. The rest of me argued that I should get as far from that spot as possible. In the end, I kept going. Even now, I haven't made sense of what happened, or what was possibly lurking in that empty patch of forest. A few days later, a storm caught me and a group of thru hikers near Mount Rogers. Rain hammered the metal roof of a simple shelter, thunder rolling across the sky. We were soaked, shivering, and half-starved. Someone remembered that a local pizza place would deliver to the parking lot if you sweet-talked them enough. The idea of hot food and maybe a six-pack had us pooling whatever money we had left. After a tense wait, lightning flickering in the distance, we spotted headlights. Naturally, we figured our food had arrived. Several of us shuffled out into the downpour, layered in soaked clothes, boots caked in mud, hair plastered to our faces. We must have looked like a nightmare. The driver saw us coming and slammed on the high beams. Tires screeched, reverse lights glowed bright red, and the van spun around so fast we all stood there in confusion. We watched the vehicle vanish back down the road, fishtailing like it was desperate to escape. We exchanged baffled looks, water dripping down our faces, and laughed nervously. Some of the group started joking. Maybe we seemed like forest ghouls or something. 5 minutes later, like clockwork, a different car pulled up, and this time, the driver hopped out, completely unfazed. Apparently he was the real pizza guy, used to hikers in all their rain-soaked glory. He handed over hot pizza boxes, a few cans of cheap beer, and chuckled about us looking like zombies. I can only guess what the first driver's story would be afterward. How a band of unholy creatures approached his van in the middle of nowhere at night. In those moments, I realized that the Appalachian Trail doesn't just feed on spooky legends. Sometimes, genuine comedy and confusion overshadow the fear. Yet, for all the laughs we shared over that botched pizza delivery, I still had the memory of that unsettling whine in Pennsylvania fresh in my head. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd only scratched the surface. The trail has this way of revealing its secrets when you least expect it. One minute you're joking around, dripping wet, begging for food. The next, you're bolting from an unexplainable force in the dead of night. Even now, I look back at Pennsylvania and feel a pang of discomfort. Whatever I sensed out there, whatever generated that unearthly noise, made me think there are places along the trail better left alone, maybe forever. And yet part of me can't resist the pull to keep exploring, half expecting to stumble onto some ancient mystery that refuses to stay buried. Guess that's the real paradox of the Appalachian Trail. It draws you in with beauty, then leaves you with questions that linger, night after night. I've been living out here in the Appalachian Mountains for most of my life, and I always thought I knew what to expect once the sun went down. Coyotes yipping in the distance, maybe a black bear rustling around. Nothing much shakes me. But on this night, everything changed. Let me start by saying my evening had been uneventful, just chores and a quick dinner before midnight rolled around. Jax, my retriever, was curled up by the fireplace like he always is. He's the most relaxed dog on the planet, rarely even barks unless the mailman shows up. That's why I nearly dropped my coffee when I heard this growl coming from him, deep and raw, unlike anything I'd heard before. I glanced at him, and saw he was standing rigid, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the window. I couldn't see anything but my own reflection in the glass, and I tried to shrug it off, mumbling something like, "Easy, buddy." But inside I was rattled. I've never seen Jax look that tense, tail stiff, nose practically glued to the window. It was enough to get my heart pounding. Soon, I realized I still had to lock up my workshop down the slope behind the house. Normally this isn't a big deal, just a quick trip in the dark with a flashlight. But the way Jax was acting, let's just say I was on edge. Still, I convinced myself it was no big deal. I grabbed my coat, clicked on the flashlight, and headed out. Jax insisted on coming, practically pressing against my leg with every step. Outside, the air felt strange. I couldn't place why. Maybe it was too still. No crickets, no wind through the branches, just a heavy quiet. Halfway to the workshop, Jax let out another warning growl that made my stomach tighten. Before I could turn on my heel, I noticed the workshop door was slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to keep going. I tugged the door shut and locked it, and that's when this insane commotion erupted in the woods behind me. I can't fully do the sound justice, but it was like a sudden surge of noise tearing through the undergrowth. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, almost like a crowd sprinting among the trees. I froze, and Jax just pressed against me, teeth bared. Whatever caused that ruckus had to be larger than a raccoon or fox. It sounded massive. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the flashlight, nearly dropping it. I backed up toward the house, trying not to break into a sprint, though my legs were begging me to run. The closer we got to the porch, the more frantic everything felt. I got inside, practically shoved the door shut, and slid the deadbolt into place. My brain was racing, trying to explain what I'd just heard. A bunch of deer. A bear with cubs. But it was so loud, so widespread, like multiple creatures. I stood in the hallway, breath hitching, Jax at my feet, staring at the door. I realized I'd left my pistol upstairs. Adrenaline was making my hands tremble. My pulse hammered as I rushed to my bedroom, grabbed the gun, and made sure it was loaded. I've never felt so desperate to be armed in my own home. Just as I debated whether to investigate or hide, Jax let out a bark. That bark. He only does that when something's seriously wrong. So, against every instinct, I headed back out onto the porch with my flashlight and pistol. My chest was tight, my breathing uneven, but I needed to know if there was an intruder or some animal messing around. I scanned the tree line with the beam. Nothing moved. Silence reigned, almost unnaturally, as though nature itself took a step back, waiting to see what I'd do next. Then, just as I was about to turn and go inside, I heard this low murmur, more like a swarm of hushed voices than a single sound. It came from the very edge of my property, out near where the trees thickened. My stomach dropped. It didn't sound like English, but it was disturbingly close to speech. Jax whimpered, tail tucked, as if he wanted to drag me inside. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like eyes were on me, a presence both everywhere and nowhere. The murmurs seemed to shift direction, echoing out from multiple spots at once. My light swept across the yard, revealing not one silhouette, not one flicker of movement. Yet the voices, if that's what they were, didn't stop. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might collapse right there on the porch. I forced myself to breathe through it, whispering Jax's name for a shred of comfort. After what felt like ages, I managed to pull myself back inside. That door had never felt so flimsy. I latched it and checked the windows, too spooked to turn on any indoor lights, hoping that darkness would hide me. The night wasn't over though. I had a terrible feeling this was only the beginning. Like whatever was out there wasn't done with me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with some random animal. This felt orchestrated, purposeful, and it was tightening around me, step by step. I didn't have a clue what was causing it, but I knew one thing for sure. My home, my safe space, was no longer secure. Jax's instincts had been right from the start, and I dreaded what might be next. I had barely closed my eyes for a second, couldn't rest even if I tried, with every nerve in my body on high alert. Jax was tense, pacing the living room and refusing to leave the front door. I kept the lights off, thinking somehow it would make me less of a target. My phone sat on the table, but out here in the middle of nowhere, good luck trying to call for help. Even if I did get a signal, what could I possibly say to emergency services? Hello, yes, there are voices surrounding my house, and I don't see anyone but my dog is freaking out. That weird muttering from outside seemed to vibrate through the walls, like a low chorus of whispers just behind the wooden panels. It was maddening because I couldn't single out a phrase or identify if it was even human speech. It rose and fell in waves, and every so often it almost sounded like chanting, I guess. I was too rattled to be sure. All I knew was that my gut told me there were multiple presences out there. More than one set of footsteps had circled the house after I first came inside. After another minute of pacing, I finally thought, screw it, I need to see what's happening. I edged over to the window beside my front door, careful not to rustle the curtains. The instant I leaned forward, the noise outside cut off, like someone hit a switch. In its place was the deepest, most all-consuming silence. Not a single insect chirping, no rustle of leaves, just my own ragged breathing. I can't express how unsettling it is to realize that whatever's out there knows when you move. The second I froze, I heard a slight shuffle near the corner of the house. Then that quiet murmuring started back up again, more agitated than before. I grabbed my pistol from the coffee table and quietly approached another window that looked out toward the gravel driveway. Jax followed, ears down and tail stiff, as if he expected an attack. When I shifted the curtain a millimeter, the mumbles faded out again. Something was definitely keyed into every movement I made, and that realization caused my stomach to churn. Time dragged on. I checked my phone. 1:47 a.m. It had only been an hour since I'd first heard that thunderous crashing in the woods, but it felt like half the night had passed. I decided to kill the darkness with a chance at visibility, so I clicked on the porch light. Nothing in the yard, no bodies, no shapes, not even a stray raccoon. My flashlight remained on the table, but I felt no urge to go out there again. A part of me sensed if I opened that door, I'd be swallowed whole. Jax's eyes stayed locked on the windows. Now and then, a single footstep crunched the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. One step, pause, another step, Pause. It was unbearable not to open a window and yell, but I couldn't bring myself to be that reckless. My mind kept thinking back on old stories from my grandparents, about things in the hills that weren't exactly animal, and not quite human either. Tales I'd once dismissed as pure folklore. But here I was, feeling cornered by something I couldn't see. To keep myself sane, I jotted notes on a pad. What times I heard the footsteps, what they sounded like, how the whispering seemed to move around the property in a clockwise pattern. Once or twice, I considered switching on music or the TV just to drown it out, but a voice in my head told me to stay alert, not to mask the sounds. After all, if something crashed through the door, I needed to know instantly. Hours crawled by this way. My nerves were shot, my hands clammy, and every muscle ached with tension. I found myself drifting off only to jolt awake seconds later whenever Jax twitched. It was like living on a fault line, expecting the earth to quake at any moment. Meanwhile, the murmurs persisted outside, underscored by that dead silent hush whenever I tried to move. It was a twisted game. They made sure I knew they were there, but not once did I see a face or a form. Sometime around 4:30, or maybe closer to 5 a.m., the tone of the murmuring changed. Hard to explain, but the pitch went lower, almost guttural. Then, slowly, the sound started drifting away, deeper into the woods. I caught faint rustling through the thick brush, then a final few snaps of branches. In their wake, frogs croaked and a couple of birds called. It was as if the natural world had been stifled all night and finally breathed again. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't that comforting. I still felt like I might vomit from the stress. I checked each window for any sign of movement. Nothing. The gravel driveway looked untouched, aside from my own footprints. Jax gradually relaxed, though he wouldn't lie down until the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon. Once I was fairly certain the immediate threat had disappeared, I stepped outside onto the porch for a breath of air, pistol clutched tight in my hand. The yard was a mess of broken branches, and the lingering smell of disturbed soil clung to the morning breeze. Yet, bizarrely, there were no footprints, no trace of a crowd or gang of animals. The only proof was in my shaking limbs and Jax's raw-edged stare. I spent sunrise going back and forth, mentally replaying each horrifying moment. My place still felt uneasy, like the echoes of those voices might start up again any second. I didn't dare pack up and leave. Part of me needed to know if this was a one-time nightmare or an ongoing threat. I downed 2 cups of coffee, watched the brightening sky, and told myself I'd figure out what to do next. For now, daylight was my only shield, and I was not about to let my guard down. Jax and I sat there in a haunted silence, expecting something to re-emerge, hoping that it wouldn't. Sunrise brought the faintest sense of relief, yet my nerves still buzzed with every stray sound. I locked the doors, sealed every window, and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing about it fit neatly into the realm of normal. Part of me wanted to believe that it was some freak incident, maybe a collective hallucination brought on by stress. Still, the unease in my chest whispered that whatever took up residence in the darkness that night is out there, lurking beyond the edges of reason, waiting for another moment to slip back into my world. For now, I've recounted every detail here, hoping to warn others. Sometimes, the eerie stories we dismiss might be truer than we're willing to admit. I was closing in on Duncannon, feeling that mix of exhaustion and excitement that comes when you're too far gone to turn around, but not quite close enough to celebrate. About 10 miles out, I spotted a small group of older women huddled around a couple of picnic tables near the trail. They waved me over with warm smiles, so I joined them to rest my legs a bit. They asked if I was a through hiker, and seemed genuinely thrilled about my progress. We traded a few stories. I told them where I started, how many states I'd already trudged through. It felt like your average friendly chatter until they asked where I was sleeping that night. Soon as I mentioned some older shelter a few miles shy of town, their energy shifted. One of them said, "You should really head into Duncannon tonight," while another repeated the advice, adding nothing else, just the same warning. None of them spelled out why, and I remember thinking, are they worried about the weather or something? But their eyes had this urgency, like they knew something I didn't. I tried to press them for details, but they brushed it off, insisting it'd be better if I pushed on to town. My pack was heavy, and my feet were screaming at me, so heading all the way in felt like an extra challenge. Their unease was contagious, though. As I said my goodbyes, that tension they carried clung to me like a damp chill. By late afternoon, I found myself turning off the main stretch of the Appalachian Trail, following a steep side path toward the shelter. The slope was trickier than I expected, with old roots and loose stones that had me stumbling more than once. Overhead, the light was already starting to fade behind thick branches. Normally, I'd be okay with a few hours of dusk hiking, but something about that place just felt heavy. Eventually, I reached two battered structures that I knew from my guidebook were built by Earl Schaffer. He was basically AT royalty, having been the first person to ever hike the entire trail in one go. The shelters looked ancient, sagging in spots, and the musty boards gave off a whiff of age and rot. Nearby was a new shelter under construction, and even from a distance, I noticed carved faces on the beam ends. They peered out in a way I couldn't quite describe, like silent observers in the dying light. I could have stayed in the half-finished shelter, but it seemed even more unsettling with those carved heads, so I stuck to one of the old ones. Inside, the shelter's floor was just round logs placed side by side, barely lifted off the ground. It made for a pretty uneven sleeping surface. I figured I'd seen worse. This was the AT after all. But something about that rickety setup gave me an odd sense of discomfort. I tried to focus on other things. Next day's mileage, where I'd get water, a possible 0 day in Duncannon. But whenever I paused, that prickly awareness returned, like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing around, seeing nothing but old wood, leaves, and a few spiders skittering in the corners. I made dinner quickly, more to keep my hands busy than anything. Every so often, a gust of wind would whistle through the beams, and the shelter groaned like it had a voice of its own. My mind flicked back to the women at the picnic tables. Why were they so insistent I shouldn't be here? The question nagged at me, but without a concrete reason, I brushed it off as local superstition or overprotection. Night fell harder than usual, it seemed. The woods beyond the shelter entrance looked like a solid wall of black. My headlamp beam danced around, catching the edges of rocks and roots outside, but I couldn't shake the weirdness. I tried to sleep, but my senses stayed on high alert. Sometimes a crack of a branch snapped me awake, or a rustle of movement made me think there was someone, or something, lurking beyond the circle of light. When morning finally arrived, the relief I felt was intense. Packing up, I almost sprinted up that trail, my body protesting the sudden climb, but my mind demanding we get moving. With each step, the weight of the place seemed to lessen, replaced by fresh air and the promise of Duncannon's comforts. Still, I couldn't completely shake a lingering unease, like I'd just crawled out from under a dark cloud. It wasn't until I reached town, found a phone, and updated my mail drop contact that I got slapped in the face with the real story. I mentioned that shelter, offhandedly describing it as seriously creepy. That's when she told me about the two hikers. They'd been southbounders, having a friendly chat with a random bar patron in Duncannon. Later that night, this same patron had followed them to that very shelter, waited until they were asleep, and murdered them. Hearing it made my stomach twist, replaying every odd vibe I'd felt, every unsettling sound during the night. Those women at the picnic tables had tried to warn me, but they couldn't bring themselves to say why out loud. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, knowing now what happened in those walls. It was more than just an old shelter. It was a crime scene, a place stained by something monstrous. If I had known, would I still have slept there? Maybe not. But the thought of it being so close to where two people lost their lives shifted the trail in my mind. The wilderness wasn't just bears and storms. It could hold human darkness too. And I had just walked right into it. I came back to that stretch of the trail a few years later. I hadn't really planned on returning. There was a part of me that wanted to avoid that entire area, after learning what had gone down at the old shelters. But life and my hiking routes had a funny way of circling back on themselves. Before I knew it, I was standing at the same cutoff from the main trail, peering down the slope with this knot in my stomach. The trees here looked familiar, yet different. Maybe older or scarred by storms. Sunlight trickled through the canopy in thin beams, and a low breeze made the branches sway. I swear it felt like the forest was reminding me, we remember what happened here. Going down that path, I half expected to see the two old shelters just as they'd been. My memory was vivid, those ramshackle logs, the musty smell, the new shelter mid-construction with the carved faces. But when I reached the bottom, I was greeted by an entirely changed scene. The two ancient structures had been torn out, no trace but a few piles of splintered wood near the edge of the clearing. Instead, the new shelter stood proudly in their place, fully completed. The carved faces I'd glimpsed years ago were still there, only now smoothed by weather, or maybe by countless hikers running their hands along them. They seemed less like art and more like watchful eyes. I hesitated, feeling a swirl of relief that the murderous old shelters were gone, mixed with a weird nostalgia for the original version of the place, even if it had been dangerously creepy. As I moved closer, I noticed someone sitting on the newly built porch, sipping from a battered canteen. He wore a bandana and looked like he'd seen a lot of trail miles. When he looked up, I nodded a greeting, and he waved me over. We got to talking as hikers do. Turns out he'd thru-hiked the trail a few years back, and had come out for a weekend getaway. It wasn't long before we drifted into the subject of the area's grim history. Apparently, there was a formal dedication ceremony once the new shelter was finished. And from what he'd heard, Earl Schaffer himself had been there, only to be brushed off or overshadowed by certain officials. Folks who didn't get the depth of his contribution, or maybe just didn't care. Hearing that made me bristle. Earl had literally shaped part of the trail's legacy, these shelters, the story of the first thru hike, and it hurt to imagine him being sidelined. The conversation took a darker turn when we ventured into the topic of those murders. My companion knew about them too, of course. Everyone who's hiked this area for long enough picks up the rumors, if not the exact details. But he also mentioned how, despite the tragedy, folks in town tried to move on. The new shelter was supposed to symbolize a fresh start, a safe space for hikers passing through. Only, he said, some people believed the land itself still felt tainted, as though the violence of that night hadn't just vanished when the old shelters got ripped out. Have you felt it? He asked me, eyes locked onto mine. That heavy quiet? I gave a slow nod, remembering the sensation of dread from my own first night here. We both fell into silence, broken only by the rustle of wind and the distant babble of a creek. Eventually, he packed up and left, heading back toward town. I hung around a bit, taking in the new shelter. It looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Just sturdy beams, a proper roof, and enough space to fit a handful of hikers. But those carved faces unnerved me. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn they were almost aware. As if they'd seen more than they let on, listening for footsteps in the night. Later on, I found myself walking north again. The trail was peaceful, the kind of gentle climb that usually empties my mind of worries. Only this time, my thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened there. I wondered if a fresh coat of wood and a brand new name could really erase the memory of two hikers who'd never made it out. A piece of me doubted it. A few weeks down the line, I came across Pierce Pond Shelter in Maine. Beautiful spot, picturesque pond, vibrant autumn colors. But the instant I got there, I felt a pang of that same uneasy tension I'd experienced in Pennsylvania. It wasn't rational. There was no recorded tragedy I knew of, no creeping murderer lurking behind a pine tree. Still, the place had this hush, like it was waiting for something. I tried shaking it off, chalking it up to hiker paranoia, or lingering trauma from that other shelter. Yet, as the sun dipped below the pines, the atmosphere felt suffocating. Every rustle outside set my nerves on edge. That's when I started to wonder if it was me. If I was carrying this darkness from shelter to shelter, replaying it in every unfamiliar corner of the trail. The thought alone was enough to keep me wide awake, scanning for silhouettes in the dark. Eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but not peacefully. In the morning, the chill still clung to me. I realized it's not as simple as a single terrible event in one place, or some new construction replacing old bones. The trail might be full of kind souls and breathtaking sights, but it can also trap echoes of the worst moments experienced by those who walked it. The deeper truth is that no matter how many signs we put up or improvements we make, history has a nasty habit of haunting whatever ground it clings to. I left Pierce Pond Shelter feeling a little more shaken, a little more aware of how quickly these woods can go from comforting to unnerving. And as I hiked on, the thought kept circling in my head. The real danger out here isn't always the wildlife or the elements. Sometimes it's the people you cross paths with, and the echoes they leave behind, long after they're gone. Be careful out there. I've always said these Appalachian mountains were in my bloodstream, a legacy from my grandfather in Boone County, West Virginia. Every time I roll down the highway and see those steep ridges rising in the distance, something inside me sparks to life, like part of me recognizes home. This time, though, that welcome feeling came bundled with an unsettling undercurrent I couldn't quite explain. The plan was simple enough: drive from Michigan to New York City, pick up my friend who needed extra help traveling, and head back to Detroit. I'd done cross-country treks before, so I didn't expect anything beyond the usual long-haul hassle. The first few hours were honestly too quiet. I got pulled over in Ohio for a busted headlight, and even though the trooper was polite, my nerves still buzzed the rest of the night. The idea of sleeping in my car at a rest stop sounded okay at first, but every shuffle of footsteps outside made me sit up and peer into the dark. Eventually I dozed off, but it was a half-baked sort of sleep that left me feeling ragged. By mid-morning, I was back on the road, cutting through Pennsylvania, and drinking in the misty peaks off in the distance. Something about those valleys always puts me on edge and at ease all at once, like I belong there, but I also know the land can turn dangerous without warning. The hours ticked by, traffic thickened, and soon I was in the sprawling chaos of New York City. After a painful search for parking, I finally spotted my friend. She hopped into my cramped PT Cruiser, and I was eager to leave the city behind. There's a hyper-awareness that creeps in when I'm stuck in that much congestion. Too many headlights, too many people, and not enough personal space. We were both relieved to point the car west again. Darkness wasn't far off by the time we made decent progress. We'd agreed to pull into a large store parking lot somewhere in western Pennsylvania for the night. Somewhere bright enough and busy enough that we wouldn't feel vulnerable. That's where things started getting weird. I rolled into a Walmart lot that was mostly empty except for a handful of cars clustered near the entrance. But parked a little too far out were two vehicles that gave me a sour feeling. Dark tinted windows, engines idling like they were waiting on something. I tried to wave off my own paranoia, but every time I glanced over, one of the cars seemed to shift closer. My friend noticed it too. She nudged my arm and whispered, "Is it just me, or are they edging toward us?" Her voice was shaky, and it confirmed I wasn't imagining things. I felt tension coil in my gut. We decided to bail. No point in testing our luck. Neither of us wanted to be cornered by strangers in the middle of the night. Pulling out of that lot, I could feel my hands clenching the steering wheel. Driving away eased the pressure only slightly. The next rest stop we aimed for was tucked between shadowy ridges, nearly deserted. My headlights swept over scattered parking spots, and there in the corner was a white Jeep. Newish model, tinted windows, not a soul in sight around it. In the back of my head, I was screaming at myself that I was just being jittery, but I couldn't shake the thought. What if it followed us from the lot? It seemed too coincidental. My friend leaned forward, trying to see if anyone was inside, and that quiet question hung in the air. Could it be the same one? We didn't linger long enough to find out. I swung the car around and got back on the highway, half expecting the Jeep's headlights to pop up in my mirror. For a while, it was just darkness and winding roads. The trees crowding in on either side. My friend and I didn't talk much, We were both in our own heads. Every distant glimmer of lights behind us made my muscles tighten. A few times I caught myself speeding, pushing my old PT Cruiser harder than I should have, just wanting to be around other people, bright lights, safety. Maybe it was overblown fear, or maybe not. Eventually we spotted another big box store off the highway, a place that was open all night. We drifted into the lot, found a spot neither too hidden nor too exposed, and tried to settle in. My friend reclined her seat, fiddling with her phone, and I leaned against the door, letting my eyes close. The adrenaline buzz was fading, replaced by sheer exhaustion. The plan was simple. Get some rest, wake up, and push on at dawn. That's all we needed, right? But a nagging alarm kept sounding in the back of my mind. I couldn't help imagining a set of headlights rolling in beside us again. I'd always prided myself on having good instincts, especially on the road, and something was shouting at me to stay alert. Maybe the night was messing with my head, maybe it was the mountain air, but I couldn't settle. I just kept checking the rearview mirror and scanning the corners of the lot, half conscious, waiting for a sign that everything was about to unravel. Looking back, I should have known I wasn't going to get a peaceful rest. The real trouble was just around the corner, and a part of me sensed it even then. The mountains have a way of holding secrets close, and that night, it felt like I was driving straight into one. I'd been through my fair share of late-night drives, but none that left me quite this tense. We'd found another big parking lot, a large store glowing in the distance like some lifeline, and I figured we could finally try to rest. My friend was nodding off in the passenger seat, leaning her head against the window. My eyes felt heavy, but every time I let them close, I'd jolt awake at the faintest hint of movement in my mirrors. At first, the lot seemed almost peaceful, only a smattering of cars, plenty of overhead lights, and the steady hum of night shift employees hauling carts around. I tried to tell myself we'd been imagining things earlier, that those suspicious vehicles were just random folks passing through. Then I spotted headlights drifting in from the far side of the lot, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened again. A white Jeep Compass glided across the asphalt and parked right next to us. There were at least a dozen other open spaces, so why pick the one so close? I glanced to my left, and there he was, the same driver who'd been lingering in my memory, like a fleeting shadow I couldn't quite get rid of. He was young but worn somehow, his gaze heavy and unflinching. A cold energy rolled off him, making my nerves flare. Part of me wanted to brush it off, assume I was just stuck in my own fears, but the longer we locked eyes, the more certain I became that this wasn't random. My friend must have sensed it too. She snapped awake, following my stare. I heard her mutter something like, "Not again." And that was all the push I needed. I cranked the ignition, yanked the gear shift into drive, and tore out of there. The wheels squealed, echoing across the mostly empty lot. I almost expected the Jeep to remain behind, some bizarre coincidence put to rest. Instead, the headlights came to life and stuck to our bumper. I felt a jolt of adrenaline rush through my limbs as I realized we were being followed yet again. The highway ramp was up ahead, and I gunned it, hoping I could leave him behind in the open stretches of road. But once I merged, those lights were still there, unwavering. Mile after mile, I tried to ignore the tightness in my chest, the nagging thought that I'd let this go too far. Yet I couldn't slow down, not with that Jeep trailing me like it was locked on. Ahead, the mountains rose against the sky, dark silhouettes capped by faint moonlight. We thundered onto an exit, hoping to lose him in the twists and turns of back roads. My friend pulled out her phone, trying to chart a route that might confuse any pursuer. We zigzagged through narrow highways, winding through steep valleys and lonely clusters of trees, the path weaving in a dizzying snake-like pattern. Each time I dared glance back, those headlights burned in the darkness, unshaken by the hairpin curves. Exhaustion gnawed at me, and I wondered how long we could keep this up without making a critical mistake. The roads were almost deserted, lined with battered guardrails, and the endless silhouettes of sloping ridges. Everything in me wanted to stop, to catch a moment's calm, but my instincts hollered that would be a terrible idea with this creep hanging on our tail. Then, In a flash of brilliance or desperation, I'm still not sure which, I yanked the wheel onto a hidden side route. The Jeep sped past our turn, its taillights flaring red as it tried to brake too late. A wave of relief washed over me when I realized we might have slipped his grasp. I continued down this narrow road until we reached an aging wooden sign pointing to a smaller town. Streetlights became more frequent. The black outline of the mountains gave way to a dimly lit main street, and for the first time in hours, I let myself breathe. A fast food place, maybe the only one open that early, glowed at the edge of the road. We pulled in, found a spot between work trucks and local cars. The safety of other humans moving around was enough to let the tension in my muscles ease a bit. My friend and I were so drained, we just collapsed against the seats, windows still rolled up tight. After so many panicked miles, the distant hum of a drive-through speaker and the smell of stale French fries felt like a blessing. When the sun finally started creeping over the ragged skyline of mountains, I stirred. My neck ached from sleeping at a weird angle. Outside, life was picking up, people stepping in and out, an elderly couple walking their dog along the sidewalk. No white Jeep in sight. You'd think I would have been relieved, but an odd sense of dread tugged at me. Had we really lost him, or was he just biding his time? I checked my phone, half expecting messages from family asking where I was, but it stayed eerily silent. The air felt thick with unresolved tension. My friend and I ordered some breakfast, greasy but hot, just to ground ourselves in something normal. Every so often we glanced out the windows, scanning each vehicle that pulled through. Nothing suspicious. Yet neither of us could fully shake the lingering paranoia. It felt like we'd gone through some twisted rite of passage in those mountains. By the time we climbed back into the car, the morning sunlight was streaming in, almost too bright against the tiredness in our faces. A part of me wished we could head straight home without another break, but I knew I had to keep an eye out for that Jeep, as though it might materialize again. The realization was chilling. A simple trip to help a friend had morphed into this frantic late-night chase. Sure, maybe we were both wound too tight. Maybe the stranger was just some random jerk on a power trip. But I couldn't shake a deeper suspicion that he was dangerous, and that under the vast sky of Appalachia, anything could happen. We buckled up and drove off, leaving that small town in the rearview mirror. Each mile of highway felt both relieving and nerve-wracking, as if something could pop out any second. By the time we found a route that led back toward Detroit, the mountains were starting to fade behind us. I couldn't help thinking about how, despite my deep respect for those old ridges, I was leaving with a new, grim awareness of the shadows they can hide. I took a final look at the looming outlines in the mirror, imagining that white Jeep hidden somewhere in the valleys, lying in wait. Even if I never found out who was behind the wheel, that night changed me. I used to think of these roads like a second home, a place of comfort and belonging. Now, a knot of tension insisted that some things are better left alone, and that wandering too far into unknown territory can lead to horrors you can't always outrun. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope tonight's stories kept you company in the dark. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe. Good night, and see you in the next one.